The Iron Wolves, one of the strongest squads, so why right now they are all running scared of the tower, and why this blonde boy is walking it up alone. 10 minutes later, the boy launches his final attack and connects clean on the boss. The creature staggers because this dude just pulled off a combo nobody's ever seen before. What kind of power does a beginner have to do that? The pressure doesn't stop. And in that moment, he reveals the real secret of this class. It's not evasion. It's explosive damage. The boss's blood spills, but the boy doesn't let up, stacking his combo again and teleporting behind it. This class that nobody wants to play, it's insanely hard to master. But when you nail the combo, the damage just keeps climbing. He leaps forward with a purple wave and launches straight at the monster, and in that second, the boss knew he was cooked. The unbeatable tower suddenly drowns in purple energy, and a single slash cuts through everything boss, walls, all of it split clean in half. The impossible mob cleared. When the other hunters rushed into the chamber, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Even the captain was frozen. But hold on, we need to rewind. How did he get this strong? Big Blue Mommy was terrorizing this gunslinger player. Bro was fighting for his life, trying every trick he had, but she was just unkillable, spamming thunder across the entire arena. He thought he had her, said adios, just to get swatted across the map with a single hit. That's when our blonde boy showed up and said he was gonna help. Blue Mommy was charging another attack, and the second the blonde kid tried to draw aggro, the gunslinger froze. A golden gear appeared beneath him. He tried to explain he didn't ask for help but was killed instantly. Before dying, he cursed at the blonde dude, saying everything was his fault. And that blonde kid? At that point, he didn't know that even though for him it was just a game, for everyone else, it was their real life on the line, until his turn came. In a flash of light, his room was destroyed, and a delicious, powerful goddess appeared right in front of him. And guess what she said? That everything was his fault too. He looked tiny in her hands. My ex said the same thing to me once, by the way. And with that, bro got a finger-crushing death, or better yet, a teleport. When he looked at his arms, he knew something was off. Explosions were going off everywhere, and Fire Mommy Bird was commanding an entire army. Thank you, artist, for making every girl in this series marryable. If I wanted to see ugly faces, I'd just walk outside. Monsters are charging. Bro runs and dives into the water. What the hell is going on? Okay, first, he's sure all those monsters are from the game. Second, those hands belong to the infamous class called Dark Knight. Yeah, blood, you're inside the game now. He spots a duo nearby, and one of them has a choosable class, meaning that's an actual player controlling it. The dude has insane aura and easily solos Mommy Bird. But the moment our boy tries to warn him about something, that same golden gear appears under his foot, and he can't speak or move. The duo just walks away while the girl thanks the so-called Binoch. In another boss fight, he keeps trying to talk to the dude, but it's like the guy can't hear him at all. Bro turns into a popsicle while our boy is trying to figure out why nobody's reacting to him. That's when a monster decides to attack, but he blocks it on pure instinct and slices the creature with ease. And that's when it clicks. If this is the game where he was a top player, then even with this cursed class, he could easily destroy them all. He knew every single combo of the Dark Knight, and now that he's face to face, envisioning the sequences is even easier. Uppercut, dash, brief cut into a basic attack. The boss casts an ice pillar thinking he's got the boy trapped, but the time stop combo activates. He appears from behind and sashamis the guy. Looks broken. Is insanely hard to pull off, but it's the most basic technique for a Dark Knight. Boom. The mirror shatters and Thigh Goddess appears once again. She reveals that he successfully passed the test and earned the real quest. He who dedicated his entire life to the world of Arid had the talent all alone, and since he messed up the gunslinger's quest, this is now his obligation. The world of Arid is getting corrupted by a strange contamination. If things keep going this way, every person there will die. But Thai's mommy is benevolent. She gave him a choice between multiple legendary items. Bro was drooling over the legendaries until he had an idea. He chose a crown that lets him equip any item 10 levels above his own. Crown equipped. And just like that, he's sent back into the game. Blonde Queen says she'll be watching his journey. He gets sent away but swears that one day she will kneel before him. After that, the MC followed Blade Dude for a while, then went to collect items in the forest, all while remembering that the goddess said he needs to reach 38,095 fame to enter the Hall of Dimensions. That's the only way back to his planet. Next day, he finally reaches the main city of Hendenmeyer, the hub for all players. He's strolling through happily when he spots a girl challenging people to duels. Her name is Chobung, and at this point, I need to find the artist so I can send a thank you letter. He walks up to talk and she says he looks strong, maybe they should have a primal fight. I don't know what that means, but I'm in. My man is blushing, but for everyone watching, she's just an NPC, so they think he's some crazy dude role-playing a romance with ChatGPT. He dashes out of there fully red and heads to the guild hall for a quest. One Piece gang is killing him with their eyes, but he walks up to MILF Elf asking if she's noticed anything strange lately. For her though, nothing stranger than him. That's when the famous Iron Wolves walk into the pub, saying all rookies are the same. Our boy instantly recognizes all of them. He remembers every NPC from the game, and he knows pink-haired Lenny shouldn't show up at the tavern unless the player has cleared 2 dungeons first. Does that have to do with the contamination the goddess mentioned? The group heads out and our boy decides he has to follow them. He watches them enter the tower. He's thinking about stopping them from going in too early but gets blocked by nearby guards. That's when he remembers you need an entry pass and the only guy who sells them is Roger Levin. Unfortunately, he's on a trip. Excuse me, a sudden figure approaches the MC. Scene cuts to this guy, pure chop, talking to the guards and walking straight in. Our boy slips in with him. But then the dude says something unexpected. He's been watching our boy for a while. He laughs and says he's never seen someone so deep into role-playing that they flirt with NPCs in broad daylight. Bro's blushing like what the hell? The guy offers to carry him up to the behemoth, but our boy instantly quits the party. Somewhere else a hand slams a monitor. So, He knew about that secret, unfortunately. And with that, we're back at the tower. The moment our boy is climbing the stairs alone, and the entire Iron Wolf squad comes sprinting past him, desperate and exhausted. Thus, our protagonist begins to run as fast as possible with quick steps down the stairs. His figure moved with extreme agility while the corridors began to follow a straight path. He wondered what would happen if those tune that, since if the corruption spreads, the rest of the knights will also be affected. And thus he assumes that he needs to hurry without seeing a strange creature approaching from behind. It ended up attacking in a single strike to the head area. He is startled, but it was a superficial cut. Yet he notices another attack is coming. And so he shoves his hand into his inventory all at once, quickly pulling out his weapon to slice this dragon pup in half. But soon he realizes that several others have appeared above it, thus having to use his own sword to block one of them. With a trembling hand, he admits that he has let his guard down since this place, in the end, is already inside the dungeon that is this entire tower. Soon he ends up cutting another of the creatures while advancing towards the more powerful one. This one ended up attacking several times using its trident. However, our protagonist is able to hold it with immense strength, and thus prepares a kick, hitting it all at once. With this, he was able to distract it while another creature advanced from the side. Then the star is able to avoid this attack using a strike from his own weapon. But with the other creature attacking, he had to use his skill, quickly teleporting to a short distance above the beast. However, he noticed that more winged ones were coming, having to once again use the cancellation of animations. With this, his figure appeared further away from those two. While he admitted that the situation is really difficult, there is no time for retaliation since there are many of them there. This warrior soon approached once again while our protagonist tried to use the dark cut. However, he couldn't do that since the creature was faster. Soon he ends up falling near the wall while admitting that he is out of magic points. In the end, all of this is his fault since he didn't level up while he had the chance. But soon there was a sound that caught his attention, this being one of the traps in the area that ends up emanating a glow, and thus releases a blaze of flames upon this army. Everyone is extremely injured and more vulnerable at that moment, and our protagonist then realizes that this statue is exactly a trick that is nearby. Right after, he remembers that at the end of this statue wrote, there is something that catches his attention. Finally, he ended up running as fast as possible while everyone screamed in his direction. With this, after covering a certain distance, he realizes that he has finally found the recovery magic circle. He then advanced in that direction, knowing that it was just a necessary touch while the creatures attacked. Next, the ketchup ended up flying through the skies once again in an unknown manner. These were the creatures that ended up being torn apart by the teleportation of our protagonist, who now assumed he was much better after all, and thus he noted that he had leveled up at that moment while he was recovering. He then assumed he would ensure to repeat this a few more times to increase his strength. Both dragonoids began to advance towards the protagonist, who quickly used his Black Cross ability to defeat them with ease. One of them observed this while feeling the tension in the air. Engine Stone, however, appeared from his blind spot using his teleportation. Thus, with 3 extremely powerful thrusts, he quickly eliminated him. He then used a spinning attack to continue massacring the rest of them. Soon he thought he was acting like a true protagonist of a soap opera at that moment. And in the end, choosing the king's contract was indeed a good decision, as it immensely increased his strength. Soon the blonde continued with that slaughter while having immense fun, until suddenly, we could see a giant figure emerging. It swung its tail and noticed the bodies of its companions. Our protagonist quickly stated that he should have left earlier, as he was now at a considerable level to face it. This is the nest of the dragonoids, and their leader is called Lachius, who claims to have spotted a stranger polluting the land of the skies. Thus, he orders his servants to begin cleaning this floor stained by the human. Quickly, the creature advanced with its trident towards the protagonist, who dodged, soon using a quick strike to appear behind it, and cutting its leg, causing it to fall. Then, with a black cut, our protagonist was able to split it in half. However, he looked back seeing the other creature, and with his classic teleportation ability, he managed to evade, soon appearing behind the creature with a smile. While saying that it was slow, he prepared to launch a strike. The beast prepared while sweating with tension. However, suddenly it saw our protagonist passing by it and ended up hitting a nearby pillar. Everyone was paralyzed by this comical scene at that moment, and our protagonist was completely frozen, embarrassed and laughing. Thus, the creature took advantage and, with irritation, punched him in the face. Then we can see sometime later where he continues eliminating the creatures. He quickly decided to focus on those that were farther away above but had advanced towards him all at once. However, an explosion ended up happening. They then rose from the cloud of smoke, hoping to have hit him, but our protagonist appeared behind them at that exact moment. He then charged at them, saying that these insects were becoming annoying, and jumped towards them. However, he ended up using the crushing leap, striking the ground. With that, the creatures took the opportunity to strike his chin at that moment. It is said that the combo system allows you to skip the loading time. However, this is only allowed if you use an order in the right way. Due to this restriction, depending on your choices, it will indicate your skill with this class. Soon he ended up saying that he chose foolishly, and in the end wasted the ability twice while not noticing a trident approaching. But his instincts screamed, and he was able to defend himself while realizing that this was not just a game, but his life depending on it. However, his opponent, using its tail, was smarter and grabbed his leg, thus knocking him to the ground and surprising him. Our protagonist quickly dodged the thrust of the trident from this creature that was attacking him, and thus flexed his leg, revealing his strong muscles. Then he pulled the lizard's tail, thus unbalancing it at once. soon charging at it using his blade to eliminate it quickly. However, it was not fast enough as another creature ended up striking him from behind and piercing him. Our protagonist dodged, but realized he had come very close to a premature death. The one responsible for this was the boss of the place, who is currently growling at this very moment. Soon after, he shouted while approaching the protagonist with immense rage. Our boy, on the other hand, prepared to strike at that moment, thus launching a large wave in his direction all at once. But it ended up being reflected by the boss's arm, which felt no difficulty. In the end, he knew that this was still a final enemy, so he wouldn't be able to defeat him so easily. Soon he managed to block one of the strikes while being impressed, as several others came in his direction, forcing him to block and dodge. But the beast did not stop for a moment, as if there were no cooldown time. He could feel that he was being cornered and thus held the weapon. Meanwhile, this was exactly what the creature wanted, and so it sighed, soon launching a burst of lightning at our unsuspecting protagonist. And then we see the result of this, where he finds himself completely injured. Afterwards, he ends up being thrown against a pillar in the area. With heavy breathing, he crashes against the wall, feeling the excruciating pain in his flesh. Then he looks back, starting to reflect on what he should do, while the creature remained extremely imposing at that very moment. But gripping his weapon tightly, he knew he could not give up. And so he advanced once more, saying it hurt a lot throughout this fight. Soon the brief cut was used. However, it was blocked by the creature. He could feel himself getting weaker and thus ended up stumbling while trying to use a spinning strike. Shortly after, he fell to the ground while the creature mocked him, and raising its weapon, it questioned if the game had ended with this child's play. When preparing the final blow, our protagonist was able to teleport, but he ended up whispering something, this being his third move. The beast did not understand and soon charged forward in anger, questioning what was being said, and our protagonist, on the other hand, advanced with extreme fury while saying this was the fourth, soon striking with his muscular arms against this immense creature. This time the beast felt the weight of our protagonist's blow, soon being crushed by the overwhelming leap that was being executed. The boss questioned what pressure was being reflected upon him, since there was no source for such power being exerted. But our protagonist knows that the true essence of combos is not evasion of attack, but rather a gigantic explosive damage being projected at this moment. The creature felt the pain reaching its bones and let out a scream. However, it tried to use its electric aura to strike our protagonist, but the boy was able to dodge while maintaining a serious face. Thus, he finally thought he had reached the fifth and final attack. It is said that the more one uses skill combos, the higher their accumulation, and the fifth use is over 200% of the damage. Thus, his blade shone as the power accumulated upon it. Soon after, the great wave was unleashed all at once, and with that, it startled the creature as it felt its own death. Outside, the birds flew unaware of the danger that was coming, and a purple light began to permeate through those marble walls, while a gigantic attack emerged from our protagonist, who now shattered the entire scene just to defeat this unfortunate creature with a final blow. We can see that he is tired as the body falls to the ground, and thus announced that the nest of the dragonoids was finally cleaned by him. Suddenly, someone approached and questioned what all this commotion was, having come from down there. And so the knights noticed that there was a huge number of corpses there. They then called for the vice-captain, saying there was a person inside that location. We returned some time before, where our boy falls to the ground, saying he finally finished. And as he shows himself to be so tired, he admits it was much harder than he had thought, and finding someone to carry him would be easier. Then a light covers his body at that moment. With this, he realizes he is leveled up, thanks to the goddess who managed to restore his life. Thus, Jinstone stands up, saying it is time to collect the rewards from this battle and go to the next floor. Then looking around, he notices there are no items there. This frightens him, and he questions the reason for this at first, until a spear lands on his shoulder from a man who questions if he really defeated all the creatures. Our protagonist quickly recognizes this voice coming from behind him. This old man questions who he is and how he entered this place, which our protagonist recognizes as Hartz von Kruger. Quickly, several spears were pointed in his direction, surrounding him suddenly while they awaited a response. This man assumed he should identify himself and state his qualifications, and especially explain how he knows him at this moment. Our protagonist remains silent, saying it is impossible not to know him, because due to his unfavorable behavior, he is the only NPC with a negative personality statistic. It is then stated that the other does not seem to intend to respond, to which it is said that he is the vice-captain of the Iron Wolves, so that is why he knows him. He is then questioned how he ended up entering the tower, and the blonde assumes he received a pass from Roger Levin. This dark-skinned man questions where he is and if he can show him, but our protagonist, with a comedic tone, assumes he is not with himself at that moment. It is said that his friend ended up taking him and surprises the man, and it is mentioned that he is a bit below the stairs. With that, this gentleman assumes he will release him after verifying his identity and pass, which further irritates Jameson for the other being so meticulous without any reason. In the end, there will be serious consequences if he is lying, and our protagonist knows he shouldn't have met this person. He doesn't have time for this, since with that player visiting the tavern means that the other has already cleared the dungeon of the Darkness Vestibule. Therefore, that user must currently be reaching the last floor, which is called the Chamber of the Castle. On the way, she will end up joining NPCs, who will assist in her fight, and among them is Bon Valashtet, who is the real danger. For if that person reaches the last floor, then they will come face to face with this man, and if he is indeed the corrupt one, then it will only worsen the situation. Thus, he ends up stopping midway. The guard notices this and then questions the reason for it. But our protagonist quickly pulls out his sword using the black cut. The man questions where the blonde got that from since there was no place to store it. And so he advanced with his spear while cursing, but it was deflected. Our protagonist surprised him as he just disappeared at that moment, and then reappeared somewhere else with a certain tension in the air. This old man assumes he is just using tricks, and guarantees he will take care of this young man. But our protagonist assumes he is on a difficult path, and therefore will jump. Thus, he uses his teleportation again to make a leap and escape from there. Everyone starts to follow him all at once in a comedic chase. In the end, never having discarded his sword practice was a good thing, and as he looks at his inventory, he notices something. Suddenly, this gentleman throws his blade in his direction at that moment. The boy pulls something from his window as a form of retaliation. Soon that spear ends up hitting a bomb at that exact moment, and thus, an explosion occurs at the location, surprising this gentleman, who ends up cursing the protagonist while holding his companion's spear. He then advances, saying that this is indeed a pathetic trick. However, he widens his eyes upon noticing something, and says that the boy is just a mere weakling while observing a black liquid on the ground. Our protagonist is far away at that moment, and thus lights a bomb while finishing spreading it around the area. Everyone gets scared and tells him not to do that. However, the boy does it anyway while being called a terrorist and is told he will be killed next time. But he says they don't need to worry. After all, it only makes noise and doesn't cause real damage, and this combination is really something for beginners. He never thought he would use the items he brought from the tavern, and thus silently thanks Yusia for giving him this. Soon we can see a passage of time where the sun is already setting. The boy assumes he has wasted a lot of time after all, and thus wonders where the fighter is until he sees her further ahead. Then he is startled to realize that he has also been noticed. He would then face her, realizing that there is another adventurer there. Soon, Aganzo assumes he must hurry to a safe place, but his companion assumes that if he values his life, he wouldn't have come here, and thus guarantees that the young man just needs to make sure not to hinder them from then on. Quickly, Jimson ends up recognizing Pan Valestet and assumes he has found him, until someone shouts from behind him saying they found him. Thus our protagonist is startled to see the man he had evaded. This man, completely irritated, assumes that throwing a bomb in his face was extremely disrespectful and now has to respond in kind. He is soon questioned about what is happening, and our protagonist realizes he is in trouble. Then the old man tells the captain to grab this meddler as quickly as possible, and so both prepare to duel, frightening our protagonist, who now realizes he has nowhere to run after all. The man, completely irritated, hopes he is prepared. With that, he gives an idea to our boy at that moment, who then points upwards, saying there is a flying naked man wanting to relieve himself on them. Everyone looks up and assumes there is nothing there, but our protagonist is clever enough to jump at that moment, thus descending several floors at once towards a probable death. Everyone was startled to look down with visible confusion on their faces. Our protagonist quickly shoved his blade into the wall, soon managing to slide down it and head towards a safe place, where he finally manages to reach the desired floor, thus entering with a leap at that moment, and lands with a bit of evident difficulty in his breathing. But he assumes that he was right in front of him, and luckily it seems that the corruption hasn't spread. Regardless of their plan, he needs to find a way to purify before they reach the next dungeon. Soon the woman assumes that this person was indeed strange, of which it is said there are many like that. In the end, they should just forget about it since he finds himself exhausted, and thus suggests they take a break before the next floor, so we can see some time later with someone breathing heavily. Being our protagonist who doesn't want to see any more stairs for the rest of his life, and thus wonders where that fighter is. Until someone shouted for Bhan to stop what he was doing. Quickly, the protagonist advanced, seeing in front of him the scene of this man about to attack his companion. He assumed he had arrived too late while being startled. But that was actually just a situation of massage among friends, since this man is actually extremely generous. Our protagonist fell to the ground incredulous to hide at that moment. He observes from afar while believing that everything is still fine. In the end, he ensures to keep an eye out since he needs to see the true colors of this man to purify him. However, it is clear that he is already doubting his suspicion about this man, for the other did not try to harm the other NPCs or even the user. And even his position as captain is evident when he does not try to control the order of the knights. In fact, everything he was thinking occurred in the opposite way, since this guy seems to be completely normal after all. Soon, it is said that they need to investigate this floor since it will be easier to find the master, and thus he assumes he will go with Bond from there. Next, the man in high boots begins to approach, thus standing in front of the fighter and staring at her with a smile. Soon, he brought his hand closer, putting our protagonist on alert once again. But as a good person, he just assumes he will see her later. In the end, he seems suspicious, but has still done nothing, and even now followed the role that was originally being played in the game. Quickly, the protagonist realizes that Ban might not be the corrupt one, and he questions why the knights are in that location. Based on his experience, Jinsun thought that the knights wouldn't appear. However, it was impossible to see the outside, and this could be omitted by the game itself. Thus we can see that both men have just arrived in front of the enemy, which consists of several reanimated creatures ready to defeat them. The two prepared themselves while it was said that the owner of this place has no manners, and thus assumes they need to go to the boss. Our protagonist quickly realizes what is being said and begins to reason. Since stopping to think, he recalls that when he defeated the last enemy, he obtained a card. And if we take into account the original story, this NPC shouldn't die there, so it would be better to say that the current corruption isn't there. but rather with the boss monster that permeates throughout this tower. Thus he thinks that the more he reasons, the more sense it ends up making. Soon the boss of the Knights questions if that idiot Hearts is still looking for the blonde, to which it is said yes. In the end, this is a big problem since everyone is after the same, and therefore he assumes he needs to find a way to resolve this. Soon we can see another floor that resembles an aquarium. A man prepares his katana at that exact moment, thus eliminating one of the creatures with a movement so fast that we can barely see. The body falls to the ground while a lady approaches him. She assumes she is always impressed with his skills, to which it is said not to play around with an old man. In the end, they have come very far, so they must be close to there. Soon the bald man asks Sharon to take a step to his side. Thus he ends up using one of his powerful attacks in one direction. The woman then questions GSD about what is happening, and he then reveals that he thought that was just a monster. Even though he held on to withstand an attack, he must be extremely skilled, yet Jinstone still appears unable to control his phantom arm, and he thinks that old man almost killed him with that move he just made. They end up being impressed by an adventurer and are following at that moment, and thus the boy reveals that he has a favor to ask. In the end, both end up recognizing that the protagonist seems to know them after all. He thinks they will be great people to join and be companions, and thus assumes he wants to join the two. The woman quickly questions why they should accept since they just met, and our protagonist was sure he would reject it, and this was used since turning distrust into trust would give him a better chance. So he remembers that there is only one way to win at that moment. Soon he assumes that they will need him, then calling this gentleman the great master of the Sword of Dukan. Quickly, the woman is impressed to discover this gentleman's name, and our protagonist quickly gets excited because he remembers that. Since no one should know his true identity, however, the old man reveals that he is quite wrong. And realizing this, our protagonist assumes that a person like that exists, but it is not his name currently. Thus he remembers that this was the description of the Ghost Knight that was written in the game guide. Of course, an update could have deleted that part and even altered it, but soon some creatures end up approaching from his rear, and the old man then assumes they have guests. Our protagonist says he needs to remember the story as quickly as possible. Thus he recalls a similar name that can be presented to this gentleman, soon calling him the great son of the Tower of Despair. Sharon believes he is mistaken once again, and since they are in a hurry, they will let him leave. However, this gentleman quickly began to emanate an immense aura from his body, soon tearing apart the creatures that were in front of him just with his presence. The mage was completely startled and tried to call for GSD. However, this gentleman was now calling for the blonde, thus questioning who he would be after all. And our protagonist is completely startled, after all. Not even he knew he was right. Quickly, this blonde ended up swallowing hard, feeling the tension. Thus he introduced himself as Jin Sung, saying he could be called that way. Soon we see sometime later where he is walking alongside these two figures. And thus he admitted that the gentleman was even more straightforward than he had thought. The woman thinks she has never seen GSD so serious before and remembers how the young man asked to go to the Castle of Heaven as his apprentice. In the end, all of this was necessary, since he needed an explanation for working alongside them. And the old man ended up accepting without difficulties. This lady is impressed that her companion accepted this request so easily, and so she ends up approaching and calling him sir at that moment, soon saying that, looking closely, his eyes are beautiful, and he even has great tea leaves in his guild. And for that, she questions if they can't get to know each other better, but our protagonist quickly declines, saying he has no intention of going to the Tower of Despair, and questions if he really looks like someone who would fall for that. Soon the woman assumes that the two might end up making some deals to sell information, but the little star again says no. She quickly gets irritated, but our protagonist knows he has to be careful not to get exposed in the middle of the information site made by her. But soon something catches his attention, and he questions if she happens to have any piece of the colorless cube. Sharon quickly shows it, and our protagonist reaches out with his hand to take it from her. And she questions why he is doing this and to return it, but the elder promptly tells them to stop chattering so irritatingly, for they seem to have finally arrived. Our protagonist announces that this is indeed the Lord's Palace, being the boss room, and the woman says she will put the items in her account. Soon several footsteps end up approaching at once, thus surprising both sides by this encounter. They then introduce themselves, and the man questions where they should go. But suddenly, a huge pressure ends up projecting throughout the place, forcing this captain to raise his sword at that moment. Feeling that, he questioned what it could be while feeling the strong grip on his sword. But soon he was startled upon opening his eyes and seeing something approaching, and then he had to strike to reflect the attack and not suffer anything from it. His companions soon approached and questioned if everything was all right, to which it was said that it would have been easier if he had arrived earlier. Then this immense creature with bluish skin says he is Sighart, the Lord of Light, and thus questions who dared to climb up to there. For below the authority of the Dragon Lord as the Lord of Light and guardian of this area, he orders them to leave as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, we can see the screen of the person who is playing at this moment, moving their mouse like this, choosing to skip all this dialogue that is happening. Soon the fighter ended up running towards the opponent as fast as possible. Everyone is impressed. However, the cavalry leader admits that they also need to hurry because they can't fall behind. Suddenly, our protagonist appears, questioning if he can help, to which the vice captain promptly acknowledges. This is the little blonde terrorist from before who caused a lot of trouble. He quickly assumes he will kill him as fast as possible. However, someone ends up stopping him. This is the old man who claims he can't do that because Jim Sung is his apprentice. In the end, it seems they had a small misunderstanding, and he says to resolve it later since the situation doesn't seem very favorable. The man gets irritated. However, his boss announces that they will do this from now on, because if they want to get out of there alive, they need to put the problem aside and start working for real. Soon, the creatures begin to advance as quickly as possible. The old man strikes them with his blade, easily ending their lives. The mage effortlessly uses her spells to assist, and thus, a true combat scene begins amidst that turbulent hall. Meanwhile, the blades clash as our protagonist thinks a bit about what is happening. Since although he is happy to receive help, he planned to just watch, he questions why there are so many. In the end, the game makes it seem like you are facing the boss alone, and it appears that those ruby pillars mark the area where you confront the creature. Everything indicates that the players cannot see what is happening there, which even brings a resolution to our boy's mind. Quickly, the boss ended up crashing to the ground, letting out a scream of pure agony due to the powerful blow. However, the woman seems not to have finished, and thus advanced once again with her clenched fist, using the seismic collision to deal another extremely powerful blow. Suddenly, all the enemies start moving, surprising the allies. They wonder what is happening since they can assume this means the leader has been defeated. Thus, they end up asking if they really managed to finish all that. However, the arm of that boss begins to move suddenly, and soon a huge light overwhelms that entire floor of the tower. With this, he resurfaces, saying that his master told him to protect this palace, and therefore he must burn everyone there to ashes if they want to stop him. The vice promptly states that the companion should stop saying things that bring bad luck, to which his captain quickly apologizes. Then the man promptly questions if the enemy is immortal, but the blonde knows that this is just the first stage and nothing is happening unexpectedly. They realize that the source of this creature's power comes from the floating castle and need to destroy the circles to start the next stage. With this, the lady orders everyone to start retreating, and our protagonist realizes that everything is going according to plan. The player responsible for this mission quickly selects to head towards the ascending castle. And thus, a path was formed which was completed in the mission. All the creatures protecting the circle began to prepare, where another stage was completed. Our protagonist noted all of this while watching the monsters being torn apart one by one. In the end, after a short time, all the requirements were met without any demand, and so they ended up returning to where the final boss of this place is located, where the last step is the simplest of all, which is to defeat Seagheart. Our protagonist ensures to watch this final clash to get the card he desires so much. The creature charged with all its strength at that moment, and the warrior did the same, wanting to eliminate it at that moment. Thus, both prepared for the clash of power that was about to be generated, which causes a huge explosion visible from outside the building. Quickly, the player can see that they finally cleared the Sky Castle and thus assumes he has to watch the story and the cutscene events. Soon it is said by the girl that she hopes there are no problems with the large magical circles. Suddenly, the blue flames of that creature finally began to fade, indicating the end of its purpose, and our protagonist stood behind it, waiting to see his final prize. However, he is startled to see that he got nothing from that creature that should have been corrupt. Outside, we can see that several birds began to fly towards the top of the tower, but they end up hitting their head against the light that was protecting above. Everyone watched that while admitting it was impressive. Since they can no longer progress, they questioned what that could be. In the end, the group of adventurers is looking for signs of the apostles, and it seems that corruption might end up messing everything up there. The mission in the Castle of Heaven has finally ended, and he hasn't received any corruption letters. He quickly starts to reason that perhaps something could happen that he himself might not have noticed, until suddenly the girl from the fort calls for her captain, questioning where he is, and our protagonist is completely startled by that unexpected figure, this being Lenny, who quickly notices him coming down the stairs. She is asked why she is there, to which it is said that she is the captain's right hand, and therefore should be nearby and could even be promoted. In the end, the young woman couldn't go with her lord before, since if it weren't for that idiot, she would probably have been there earlier. Quickly, the man above assumes they can't do anything about it, and then the pink-haired girl finally realizes her leader is up there. But our protagonist, understanding the situation, quickly extends his hand, telling her to stop. She questions why she is being stopped, to which it is said that she would corrupt a dialogue event if she appeared. In the end, he just needs to prevent this girl from continuing forward, but she shows she is embarrassed, questioning why he is staring at her like that. Soon, Jinsung reasons that this is why he couldn't find anything from the Castle of Heaven, and thus began to push the young woman. It is said that if he takes her to the first floor, then the card should appear, and he assumes everything will start shortly. Soon we can hear a whale flying through the skies at that moment. The blonde approaches, saying they will return since there are many things to report, where the old man assumes there is something causing tremors in the air, and from atop the whale, an airship was thrown where everyone notices it is approaching at a frightening speed. The cavalry leader quickly realized that this is probably the worst type of scenario possible, while the pink-haired girl wondered how this happened, and our protagonist simply said it was part of the final event. To be more specific, this is an emergency lifeboat, and the NPC Ophelia will fall in front of the group of adventurers to start the next scenario. In the end, they don't have to worry, and therefore will hurry to descend, which is said to be falling at that moment. Our protagonist asserts that there is nothing to worry about, where the young woman assumes she needs to talk to the captain to flee immediately. However, the blonde knows it is nothing dangerous, and therefore they don't need to continue with that. She tries to refuse, and Jimsun assumes he can't let her do that until it is revealed that it is heading in their direction. And our protagonist at that moment tries to warn that it's not like this is going to fall on them at first. But quickly looking back, he realized he was wrong with his statement. Thus he questioned why that was happening, since this path shouldn't be followed. In the end, this must be the real corruption found in the Castle of Heaven. With that, he opened his inventory page at once, quickly pulling out his sword and saying it wasn't to stop the girl, but rather to prevent something from happening to her. In the end, it is already too late to flee, and therefore he will have to destroy this object. But soon he remembers the words that came to his mind about the explanation of how the mech scenario will open. It is said that the story must be followed correctly without Lenny falling, and this lifeboat must also land safely. Thus we can observe more closely where a person is steering, where it is said that the progress of the story is being altered at that moment. Our protagonist thinks that this cannot be the ending he has been seeking. Soon he remembers messages from the past where they said he was someone who always gave up too easily on things. With the veins bulging on his forehead, a new determination arose at that moment. And thus an explosion occurred in the tower that connects to the sky. Something completely unbelievable began to rise at that moment, this being the airship that obeyed the protagonist's attack at once. Thus he assumed he would not give up so easily. Since his name is Baekjin-sun, and like all the other things in his life, he will never give up because he will clear the path no matter what happens. Lenny looks at him incredulously, questioning how that was stopped, and thus observes the protagonist's inventory, asking what was thrown, and it turns out to be a fruit from the tree of heaven known for exploding upon violent contact. Soon the boat began to fall again towards the ground, and our protagonist commanded it to stop while throwing another fruit, which ended up advancing towards the metal hull at a terrifying speed, and its fragile shell was hit with a strong blow just as planned, giving the necessary boost for the object to rise even higher. They questioned what that noise was since everything should be fine after all. However, they were immensely startled to realize that it was several explosions in succession from the airship that was ascending at that moment. Our protagonist continued running faster than his legs could manage, thus launching several other fruits in sequence to continue the ascent. In the end, he admitted that he could do this, since that was the only way he could accomplish it. 2 fruits were thrown at the same time to try to finish it all at once. Lenny wondered what that idiot was doing and tried to reason what was happening. Our protagonist quickly pulled another fruit and threw it at that moment while as soon as he would reach the top. However, he was startled to realize that nothing had actually been thrown from his hand. And as he looked at his window, he noticed he had run out of supplies all at once with those movements. Quickly, the airship began to fall again towards the abyss. The girl realized there was no longer enough thrust, which meant a new fall would begin. But suddenly she noticed something flying in the sky. It was our protagonist holding something in his mouth, which ended up breaking at that moment to perform something unique. This being a sequence of teleports used with extreme efficiency. He assumed that if it was for this reason, then there would be a 100% chance of success, soon placing his sword against the metal hull of the object, thus creating an extremely powerful magic circle. At that moment, the cube was crushed all at once, while assuming 200% of its power. His veins bulged as the explosion was prepared. An immense amount of shadows permeated the entire area around him, while he assumed this would be his true dark catastrophe, thus giving the necessary boost for the ship to fly to its intended location. Such energy had such power that the ship seemed to be flying again, and our protagonist could feel a clear pain while wishing it would be enough. The cavalry leader quickly ran, telling everyone to duck as fast as possible. Thus the airship finally entered the place it was supposed to be, soon catching fire with that while the others questioned what it could be. Our protagonist was happy because he knew he would succeed after all. Holding the letter, the young man smiled, assuming that the corruption was perfectly cleansed. However, he ended up failing when he remembered that there was nothing more he could do, since his weapon ended up being destroyed in the process with the explosion. But a hand suddenly gripped his arm tightly at that moment, and this startled him as he did not expect company. It was mainly Linny, the girl from before, who was watching him closely, while she assumed that from that point on, they were even. Our protagonist quickly sighed, saying he didn't expect the rebound from his dark explosion to be so strong. In the end, this sword must just be bad, and therefore he must find a way to get something new but is out of items or gold. In the end, leveling up was something that really helped, since it allowed him to learn the dark explosion that was useful at that moment. But when he uses those abilities, he needs an item like the cleaning cube fragment. They are called FCL moves, which are extremely powerful, and in the end, he will need more for other actions in the future. But now, if this is how it will be, he needs to be careful. Besides, he has no other choice but to go to the Principality of Belmire, known as the Guild of Mages. A day ago, we could observe the entrance to the Tower of Heaven, where he, completely injured, questioned what was being said. The girl pointed out, assuming that the blonde prevented the boat from killing her and that she saved his life to help him. With that, he owes her a heartfelt repayment, but the boy only thinks he should tell the guildmaster that she came on her own, making her say that if he snitches, she will kill him. However, his face takes on a cute tone like a true love-struck girl. Soon she approached with her hand, giving him a flick on the head all at once. Then she ran off, saying that at 6 o'clock on Saturday she would be waiting for him at the port entrance where he was supposed to take her for dinner. Our protagonist is startled. However, it is said that he is indeed arranging meetings after a dungeon. This really is a good and blessed life after all. Our protagonist quickly greets the Grand and Vice Masters while it is said that there is no need to be rigid since they are there to say goodbye. And the completely irritated man assumes he will be very sad to know he cannot take his head at that moment. But soon, the captain passes by his side, calling out Jim Zoom's name, while he secretly assumes they will meet again very soon. Our protagonist quickly remembers the name Von Valestat. In the end, he was not corrupted. But upon recalling the story, he assumes it is very dangerous, and therefore needs to stay away from someone like that. However, he ends up bumping into the old man from before who stares at him once again. Our protagonist quickly falls back, saying it was quite a scare. However, the old man merely states that the young man did a good job at the Tower of Heaven. Our blondie thanks him for being asked to listen, to which it is said that it is no problem since he saw that the boy really needed it. However, he assumed they still had something that needed to be conveyed at that moment. Jinsun quickly says to keep quiet about the true name of the son of the Tower of Despair, and the other assumes he will trust the waves of shadows that accompany him. Soon he ends up leaving, thus leading our protagonist with the mage at that moment. In the end, she understands that the old man also wanted her to hear that and claims to have no interest in it. She then turns to the protagonist questioning if he was the one who redirected the ship close to them. In the end, it could have simply been blown up or something like that. But he brought it to them as if it were necessary for them to find the person who was inside after all. The boy quickly fell silent at that moment, observing her directly. However, it is said that he does not need to respond to anything at that exact moment. A man also has his privacy, and it is said that he can come at any time to bargain with her. Our protagonist soon arrived at the guild while assuming it was larger than he had thought. Walking through the corridors, he assumed it was extremely grand, since he thought it would look like a small shop, just as it was shown by the visuals of the game he observed on his computer. Jinsun wonders if it is really okay to make trades with this woman since all he desires are information. In the end, corruption and even the goddess herself cannot be taken so lightly, so he questions what he can offer in return. Now without weapons or gold, all he can rely on is his knowledge of the game. And thus, the owner of the place finally approaches and states that he arrived much faster than she had thought. She soon questions if he is ready for a conversation, to which our protagonist recognizes the companion beside him. She is introduced as Iris, who reveals that she already knows our protagonist in some way. He questions how that is possible, while our protagonist assumes she is a divine NPC from the Mage Guild. He wonders if she really knows him in some way, and soon he can feel an extremely threatening presence coming from her. Such a form of power was assumed to be a shadow enveloping her being at that moment. He then took a step forward, questioning if it would really be possible. And thus, he looked at her with a determined gaze, soon revealing he knows she is the Singer of Fortune and calls her that. Questioning if she was able to see his future, since she must already know what his role is in this world they find themselves in at the moment. This seer finally opened her eyes at that moment. Thus she says she feels he is someone who deeply questions things after all. Soon a small melody was played indicating his future, and thus she withdrew, assuming that everything is predestined after all. Our protagonist heard that and squeezed her hand with that phrase, soon recognizing that it is a line from the game, which is extremely positive for him. In the end, he might have had a very deep look regarding all of this. However, the mage became curious about something. The young man promptly questioned what it was, where it is said that he was only told the name of that woman. And even so, our protagonist still knew that she could foresee the future one way or another. In the end, he knew GSD, was aware of the airship, and even knew Iris's identity. And with all this, he questioned who this man really was. Our protagonist thinks he has ruined everything just by saying that. Thus, he took a step forward with his confidence restored, soon facing the woman for a more private conversation, saying that now is the time to reveal his true identity to her. He knew this was the only option and thus admitted that, in fact, he was a person capable of seeing the future and altering it in his own way, and this is the only way he could use to sell information to this woman. Then, a few days passed, and we could observe the Mage Guild. Suddenly, something rushed through the corridors as fast as possible, almost knocking over the shelves due to the immense hurry being followed, until it reached the door of the leader of the place where our protagonist was at that moment. And thus, a young woman approached, calling for the guildmaster immediately, for they had a problem where it was said that that person had gone away, thus explaining that Lorien had indeed disappeared. In the end, the woman showed concern since that little pest had really vanished just as previously stated. Soon the magic stone was shown, and even though they tried to call her, there was no sign of response since the previous day. Quickly, the lady asked for them to search for her in the surroundings as fast as possible, which was understood. Our protagonist was behind the door in silence at that moment, and thus he stepped out, assuming he was right since Lorien Cornera had indeed vanished, known more for her arrogant personality than for her abilities. In the end, he foresaw the future where she would eventually be found after her disappearance. The woman stared at him from afar while the light from the window permeated, and thus he thought he must be crazy for saying that and questioned if it was a work of his own. In the end, this is a completely different problem from the recognition of information about Iris and Mr. GSD. However, when he remembered the airship case, he reasoned that our protagonist really does foresee things, but he shows himself to be completely cunning. After all, this is an event that occurs after the tower incident, and now he doesn't need to pay much attention in the end. Still, it seems that the mage still doesn't fully trust him. Then she apologizes for today while assuming that the woman must find Kargan as soon as possible. Quickly, the woman recognizes him as the dark elf from the city. She really doesn't understand how he can be useful, but the protagonist just says she must do it since it will be important. For in the end, she will need several daisies for a future very soon. Thus, we can observe the city where a huge circle protects it from above. Our protagonist thinks that Sharon is almost believing him, and if he can ensure the city's safety, then he will get what he desires. Most incidents are resolved before any damage occurs with the help of users who take on the role of adventurers. In the end, he will end up receiving several rewards in exchange for his help and wonders if he should ask for some gold potions or something even more expensive. Stopping to think, Jin Sung is practically deceiving everyone, but technically he isn't lying about his information. But suddenly, without paying attention, he bumps into someone who quickly recognizes him while the protagonist assumes he has spoken to himself again. The girl on the other side of the screen assumes that it is not common for most players to act so strangely, but recognizes him as a dark knight, quickly questioning if he was at the Sky Tower a few days ago, thus surprising our protagonist, who quickly turns his back, assuming he doesn't know her, at which point the man recognizes him at the same moment, assuming it has been a long time since he last saw him. In the end, it is said that he continues to act. However, his level remains very low, and thus he wants to know if he wishes to be carried. Then something catches his attention at that exact moment, and thus he whispers for Jin Sung in a private message method that makes him shout in surprise. The girl starts laughing a lot at that last message she just read. In the end, our protagonist ended up getting startled just by a subtle message and questions the reason for that, further irritating the blonde, who quickly realizes that his name was mentioned and questions how he knows that. With this, that guy assumes that the username is indeed his real name, which is quite funny in the end. Our protagonist quickly questions since when that is there. After all, since even before the Sky Tower, no one managed to recognize. Meanwhile, remember that you ended up introducing yourself to the gentleman as Jin Sung. In the end, he didn't have a username until then, and reflects that his actions really have some strange effects. Soon, this stranger snaps his fingers, admitting that he likes him quite a bit, and so he asks him to join his guild immediately. For if he accepts, they will give him intimate equipment and potions, in addition to being carried through various dungeons, but our protagonist simply declines. The man seems to ignore it, saying that there are several tutorials and things like that, until the boy gets distracted by something else. He quickly recognizes that voice and passes by that figure, heading in that direction. Ophelia continues shouting and claiming that she will take revenge no matter what happens. Our protagonist watches from afar, assuming that she is the survivor who is on the burning airship. Soon, something attacks suddenly, causing her to drop her dagger. These are the knights who say she can't exert herself since she is too fragile, and the blonde realizes that this is the story of the behemoth. And he quickly notices that the user doing this mission is Muse from the archer class. Soon the other guy who is talking to our protagonist wonders where he went during the explanation. The young woman promptly claims that the temple on top of the whale is her home. Everything about the people from this place is kept like family memories. But unfortunately, Lotus made the believers attack each other to death. And now the girl can't just sit and wait for everything to fall apart. Our protagonist watches from afar while thinking about that, since on top of the enormous creature is the GBL Order, a religious organization that protects relics above. The reason this young woman descended was that Lotus is attacking at this very moment. It is described that apostles are called rulers of the demonic realm, and there are 12 in total, and they are the main villains of this dungeon world. In the end, he didn't want to mess with him but just needs to deal with the corrupted ones, and so he observes the user calmly. Quickly, the archer turned at that moment, attracting the attention of the two men. Soon they realize that she is withdrawing from that moment, which is really an inconvenience. But it doesn't matter, and they will just go back together before the sun finishes rising, and our protagonist realizes that this is how dialogue puling works. In the end, none of them seem to be corrupted, and Pam and Aganzo will arrive at Behemoth when they return together. As this scene ended along with the dialogue, he needs to leave as quickly as possible. However, someone approaches while desperately shouting for the captain. Our protagonist is startled since he was sure that cutscene had already ended, but Lenny shouts that he will go with him no matter what happens. After the conversation with Ophelia, the group of adventurers directed by the temple's standing walls will pass through a dungeon that covers the entire giant whale. In the end, Ban, the Ganso, and the adventurer would end up going together and alone. And this means that Lenny shouldn't be there no matter what happened. The girl keeps insisting that she wants a chance to demonstrate her skills, but the man assumes that this is not the type of mission she should come on. The Vice Master quickly covers his mouth, apologizing and saying he couldn't stop her. But this gentleman appears to be thoughtful at that moment while hearing that this is not the type of enemy they can face. And then he ends up laughing, saying that he can't stop her, and therefore agrees to go together, which surprises the protagonist. If the young woman is also going, then this mission is definitely corrupted, and he needs to find a way to prevent this, just like what happened in the Sky Tower. He observes that figure completely animated while reasoning the possibilities, and so he thinks that they said they would be leaving at dawn, which could be the ideal chance. With that, we can see that the whale continues flying through the sky at that moment. Soon we see the city port where the waves crash forcefully with a heavy atmosphere. The dark elf quickly calls from the Sharon, admitting that she looks beautiful as always, and as he looks to the side, he questions what that boy is doing accompanying her. Soon it is said that he is an important guest staying at her guild, and our protagonist realizes that all the equipment is bad. He then asks if Margarita can take off suit, to which it is said that she just finished applying oil and can rise whenever she wants. However, he assumes that it is not for him and remembers when our protagonist arrived. In the early morning, he shouted in fright where the woman questioned what had happened, to which it is said that the future arrived earlier than expected. Some things will happen in Behemoth, and then the situation will spread throughout the city. She remembers that she will only know the details after she returns, and thus accepted our protagonist's request to reach the flying whale. The woman realizes that he is picking up more and more items in the end, but his information is valuable enough to be worth it. Quickly, the dark elf assumes they can have tea while they wait for all that, until a loud noise suddenly occurs behind them at that moment. Both are completely paralyzed as they observe that, and so our protagonist scratches his nose, admitting that he just touched a bit and ended up knocking everything over at that moment. The man ends up saying that he is making a huge mess and punches him in the face with all his strength. He is asked if he knows how much that costs, to which Jim-sun curses back, saying it's all trash and irritates him even more. But he quickly says he doesn't have time for that and should just put everything on the Wizard Guild's tab. Thus, we can see the doors opening all at once, where a woman claims to be the knight of the principality named Lobato and comes aboard. However, she is confronted with the scene of our protagonist apologizing to the person who is sponsoring him. Some time then passes. The one who will pilot questions about the agreement since there are many passengers, and they will have to prepare as quickly as possible. The gentleman assumes it's a surprise to see him there, and our protagonist says he is not a wizard and is just a guest at that moment. Next, the bearded man emphasizes that Sharon seems to have high expectations of him for just being a guest to her. And as he observes her, he notices a latent hatred while she holds a long list of all the damage the blonde has caused. He starts to chuckle lightly while rubbing his injury until someone notices him. Thus, the cavalry leader realizes that GSD's pupil is there, and our protagonist quickly claims he came there with the Wizard Guild for an expedition. Bon is surprised until our protagonist asks for a borrowed member since he had no chance to hire bodyguards. This gentleman accepts, leaving Lenny to stay by his side. The girl is completely embarrassed. However, our protagonist, with a mischievous smile, assumes he can monitor her more easily this way. With her mind completely clouded, she questions what he is plotting, until the dark elf shouts for everyone to board as it is of utmost urgency. Suddenly, the previous adventurer approaches, saying that everyone is there. Quickly, the sails began to unfurl amidst the skies, and that boat that was in the water finally began to fly at once. The pilot promptly put on his glasses, assuming they would depart as quickly as possible, and so the boat obeyed his call, making a dash with extreme speed, where it was said that their destination is Behemoth. Amidst the clouds, the ship made sharp turns to avoid any obstacles. Everyone, except the adventurer, was tossed from side to side, questioning what that could be. The blonde quickly realized that staying still in this situation made her practically a lifeless doll. Thus, he remembers that the fighter, while climbing the floors, was the same way, and in the end, it must be due to their loading occurring at a different time. Soon it is said they will be passing through one of the last openings at that moment, and so the ship finally got to see up close the eyes of that simply colossal whale. Everyone was astonished by such a creature soaring through the skies. Lenny looked up, realizing in shock that she had never seen anything like it. Thus she notes that Behemoth is indeed a mystical creature to be so enormous. Soon we see sometime later where they ended up landing at the location they desired, filled with the bodies of those who lived there. The pilot assumed he could not dock and thus must send a signal when they want to return. This scene was silent due to the enormous amount of heavy aura spreading around, and the captain assumed that the Sky Tower was an extremely cleaner place than there, where his companion assumed it was worse than he had fought. The dungeon opening event finally began, so he assumed he needed to keep his distance so she wouldn't see him. Soon the captain says that according to Ophelia, the lotus is located in a certain place. But suddenly a man approaches, desperately asking for help. The captain quickly recognizes those three eyes molded in the mask, which means he is from the GBL order. However, what was hiding his face began to crack suddenly while saying he should kill repeatedly, until from his body several tentacles started to emerge suddenly. This man begged for his death as quickly as possible before being controlled by the creature, who then said that those who disobey Lotus must perish as soon as possible. Soon the other creatures began to advance towards the group. The cavalry leader promptly attacked, using his sword to finish off some of the creatures. He told the adventurer not to feel any remorse, as they would think of it merely as a favor for those who would not recover. Our protagonist assumed they would stay back and observe since they needed to prepare. She put her hand forward, saying he needed to be careful as he didn't have a weapon, which the other disagreed with. It was said that earlier he looked for an interesting purchase, and as soon as he showed it, the girl was surprised. However, they didn't notice one of the creatures moving while hearing that it didn't look like a sword. Quickly, the monster lunged at the girl, who was distracted by our blonde girl at that moment, until suddenly she was pulled back in one swift motion by a hand, that being our protagonist, who drew his energy sword to eliminate the creature quickly. The creature remained alive, groaning in pain, begging for a quick death, and Jim-sun obeyed that request, performing numerous light cuts, ending by completely shredding the creature in one go while sighing. With an extremely charming tone, he asked if Lenny was okay. The girl looked at him with a flushed face of excitement at that moment, until sometime later, we can see a bridge with some sounds. Responsible for this was the archer, who was now piercing another creature. It was said that for now things were finally clear and the path could be followed. The bearded man quickly informed that the adventurer might have noticed something, since there had been eyes on them since they left the outer walls, but they picked the wrong people to spy on. And so we see that only one woman is staring at them from afar at that moment. Generally, both should try to catch them. However, it was said that they should continue on their path, for they were already approaching the area within the jungle that was their objective. Soon, the cavalryman decided to question whether the people whose minds were controlled were still capable of using magic. But our protagonist thought not, as they were merely the remnants of the battle against that person. The number who had not yet been controlled was called Isadora, who ended up chasing the group and tried to kill them before they had their minds controlled. However, they caught her by surprise and fought right there in the center of Dendroid. It was said that not a single person died there, and after the fight, the enemy became an ally and guided everyone to the path where the calamity lay. If the fight is over, that means they are heading to the next dungeon, and our protagonist thinks they are moving too slowly because of Lenny. However, the adventurer is progressing faster than expected until she receives a flick on her head. The girl questions if he is listening since his head seems full of wind. In the end, he didn't hear her and asked her to keep focused from then on. If nothing happens and the story continues to progress normally, this girl in front will end up dying. And our protagonist can clearly remember this scene in the near future. It was said to continue while the boy knows he can't do anything since he shouldn't even stop. This is an end that is already determined and cannot be changed. Thus, Jinsun ends up calling for the girl, who quickly questions what it would be. Then he decides to just joke, saying she will get hit sooner or later if she doesn't stop waiting for him. She gets annoyed by this joke, and our protagonist thinks he can't change what happens but will ensure to fill her with happy memories so she can leave happily. Quickly, the girl assumes she wanted to ask if the young man had any kind of girlfriend. He becomes startled by that phrase, freezing in place, until he stops to think and questions what kind of situation this is since he just asked her a very different question. Quickly, he begins to think for a moment until several roots start to emerge from the ground suddenly. Soon his companion manages to jump back at that instant, until our boy's hand ends up being caught by one of the creature's branches at that exact moment. Lenny calls out to Jinsum questioning if these roots really belong to a dendroid, and our protagonist reasons that some must have been left behind along the way. Thus he turns to his inventory asking to be faced since he will cut all its branches. However, he does not notice one of the creatures advancing through his rear guard at that moment, and so he thinks this could be his end since he did not pay attention to the smallest details. But his companion was able to cut the creature in one swift move using her blade. Thus she freed her companion while advancing towards the other trees. The knight wonders what that could be since everything is very strange in this jungle completely filled with beasts. It is said that this is a monster called a hunter that uses a ritual to avoid losing control. However, the girl tells him to stop talking. The atmosphere lightens as it is said that they were caught off guard, and the blonde admits he got a bit too confident. Quickly, the creatures began to advance towards the stuo, who quickly responded doing the same with our protagonist feeling confident. Thus both began to divide the creatures without any problems. Lenny was extremely proficient in using his heavy weapon, thus managing to eliminate them. A true massacre was occurring among those possessed by the demon. Our boy was laughing confidently at that moment, while Lenny also smiled, and in the end, he had already made his decision. Thus, he could see that both were tired at that moment. The girl quickly fell to the ground, startling our protagonist, who questions if she is okay to which he replies that she is very tired. In the end, she thinks she might have twisted her ankle, and thus asks for a little help. Our protagonist looks down at her and reveals that he actually has a girlfriend. He then says that this girl must know her very well. She understands with a vacant look, however, our protagonist holds her hand saying he was going on a date with her this weekend. And with a sincere smile, he admits that she could not forget the promise she made to. In the end, this might be a useless pity, however he is not doing the wrong thing, and thus admits he is not sure if he knows good restaurants. However, he did not care about any of that since he wants to do everything possible for his companion to be happy in death. While running, he questioned why he was hit where it is said that he deserves much more than that. Our protagonist says he would do his best, which made the girl even happier at that moment, seeing his sincerity. Soon both ended up arriving at the place they were destined to. Their figures passed as quickly as possible, running towards something. This being an enemy quickly divided by the two warriors. The girl called out to the protagonist, questioning if this was the right way, to which it was said yes. The first destination is the right night that comes right after the sanctuary where a special weapon is located. However, Lenny ends up calling for Jinsun once again, where they notice some traces of the archer's skill that passed through there. The girl promptly realizes there is something shining in the midst of that. And our protagonist, upon holding it, realizes it is a rare item that was left by the player who ended up letting it slip. He quickly questions what these chains are, to which it is said they are being sealed with magic. In the end, rare items and above can be magically sealed. Our protagonist asserts that all he needs to do is remove the seal. However, he is not able to do that. Quickly, he notes that he will need Sharon's help later, until something catches his attention. This being several pieces of equipment that are found there at that moment. His expression turns startled, where his companion also questions why that is scattered. Reasoning a bit, Jinsun realizes she does not need that equipment. After all, this is not her main account. Soon he grabs everything while asserting that he will take good care of them no matter what happens. Thus, some time passes, and they finally manage to reach the boss of the Forbidden Sanctuary, known as High Priest Asura. This creature calls out to Isadora saying they were family, so why did he abandon them to ensure his own survival? The captain asserts that it is possible to resist mental washing with transformation, however there is no way back. The woman quickly assumes that her companion always sought infallible methods, even if they involve forbidden knowledge for anyone else. As they approach, Lenny tries to call for the Grand Master, to which our protagonist tells him not to interfere as it could be important. And suddenly, the creature lying there ends up spitting blood while calling his companion a fool. Logo, the woman, ends up saying that they need to keep moving because they have little time. Jinsun realizes that nothing seems to be corrupted up to that point, and now one last event needs to happen for everything to go right. However, suddenly the girl trips over something and falls face first to the ground while calling for the leader. Our protagonist questions her state by chance, trying to seem funny to him. But when he looks a little down, he notices that there is a book there at that moment. And thus he realizes that this is something extremely important after all, since it is the Book of Genesis. This is a sacred tome that prophesies the fate of the apostles, which is an essential element for the story of this world. But suddenly several attacks end up cutting him at that moment. Our protagonist is startled to realize that Lenny is really annoyed by that. So he approaches and questions what is being done, where she appears confused. Jinsun assumes that this was something important until someone hears these phrases. Thus the captain starts to come back, saying that he heard a similar voice at that moment. With that, his hand moved closer to the wall while he leaned in, but he ends up finding nothing in that corridor. He walks a bit while assuming that maybe he is being too sensitive after all because of the danger. His companion questions where he is going, to which he says he is already coming back. And our protagonist assumes that they narrowly escaped being discovered, but the captain did not find the book. At that moment he questions what he can do, since things will be corrupted if it continues this way. But Lenny has a red face while she looks at him with extreme admiration, for she can see the beauty and charm that comes from the boy. Suddenly, our protagonist begins to approach the girl, who becomes extremely embarrassed. She questions why he is doing that while the boy simply tells her to be quiet at that moment. Their lips then come closer. The young woman is surprised and in doubt about what he plans to do there while they are hiding. But with a twist of expectation, our protagonist is actually rewriting the original content of the book since he has seen this countless times before. The girl asks if he is not going to continue with his act, to which he says he needs to concentrate. Thus he stands up, leaving the hiding place, assuming that he has finally managed to complete Chapter 1 of the Book of Genesis. In the end, he is not a genius, and thus questions what Lenny is waiting for, where it is said that she wants to kill him. Suddenly, the captain looks back at that moment, thus seeing that there is a book there that arrived mysteriously. Our protagonist celebrates in thought since it was successfully delivered. The man reads that they were not gods due to the lack of power, and regarding the Book of Genesis refers to them only as followers. Soon a laugh is heard and our boy questions if everything is all right. The man then walks to a part where the light permeates. In the end, he understood that this is really a record of the legends and had never heard a story like this. Even though it is not finished, he assures that he will keep this to himself from then on. Our boy observes, realizing that he is talking to someone at that moment with a strange expression, where Lenny assumes that this is the first time she sees him like this, since even when she accidentally hit him with a meatball, or when they argued, she never saw him with such a furious face, and thus questions what was shown. Our protagonist is impressed that he is angry after reading that book. In the end, he is not sure since the game's art always keeps its expression fixed, and the lines that were said are basically the same. Even so, the card still has not appeared, which means that the corruption is still ongoing. He needs to keep following him. However, his instincts are telling him that if he continues like this, he will end up in danger. Soon he calls for Lenny once again. However, a great earthquake occurs at that moment. The bearded man questions Isadora what that could be. However, the whale at that moment opened its mouth in extreme pain. Everyone felt the creature's emotions that screamed in agony. Jimson quickly reasoned that the blame for all this was Lotus, for his mind-controlled is about to reach the enormous whale. At that moment, the creature's eyes rolled back all at once, and our protagonist could feel in his own mind an image coming as an attempt at mental washing. He put his hand on his head, assuming that it had gone further than he had imagined. Soon the creature's eyes were already enveloped by a small layer of darkness. Jimsung realizes that the earthquake has just stopped, but the sinister visions still linger in his mind, and he assumes they won't be able to continue without some sort of plan. Quickly, Lenny ends up questioning what that was, where it is said that they need to go back. The girl tries to say that the Grandmaster is still there, but the blonde has just realized that he needs to report something to the guild immediately. He pulls out an object, hearing Sharon questioning how he could ask her for something like that. Until suddenly, his own communicator vibrates at that moment, catching his attention. Our protagonist assumes that she must have received the signal, so they will send the boat to come pick them up soon. His companion questions what was discovered by him, where he decides to simplify, because he found out where Lotus is going at this very moment. The girl stands outside the door, guarding with her enormous sword, until she hears a shout, questioning if he really wants to go out into the middle of the ocean. Our protagonist assumes that this place above the sky is originally where Lotus lived. He doesn't even have half of his strength because of the temple. In the end, he is controlling Behemoth to reach this location, which is said to be worse than he thought. Sharon questions what it would be, where our protagonist claims he saw in his eye the plan of Lotus working, where he manages to regain his power from the apostles to bring ruin to all of Arad. Suddenly, the woman's cup falls to the ground, shattering into several pieces. She questioned how that was possible, saying it was something that couldn't be changed. The mage quickly held his shoulders, saying there must be a way since there should be some weakness they can exploit in Lotus. Our protagonist assumes there is only one way left that he didn't want to use, extending his hand to the woman, where he asks for a single time for 100,000 gold to carry out a risky plan. Thus, he finally leaves the room, where Lenny approaches, questioning if he has finished his report, and if they can go back to the whale. Soon, Jimsun himself says they need to stop at a few places before returning, leaving the girl confused while holding 2 ice cream cones. In the end, this is the market of Hendenmeyer, and there are many interesting things there. The girl questions if she is being joked with since they can't waste time while thinking that the other players are not there and can't see her. In the end, she must have been able to sense Lotus's power and came to that place to get something that can withstand it. Lenny understands and then questions the reason for the ice cream, where it is said that it is just very delicious. Thus, they quickly arrive at their destination, where someone welcomes them. This is Kana, the owner of the warehouse, who questions what they need. Our protagonist hands over a paper saying he needs everything on this list, where she will analyze it. As soon as she reads it, she realizes it shouldn't be too complicated. However, it will still take some time, so she will need them to come back at night, where Lenny tries to assert that this is more urgent than previously thought. But our protagonist says there is nothing to be done since they will have to wait for sure. Thus, he gives a confident smile, saying they will need to stay there until nightfall after all. Now they will keep that promise to buy some food, where the warehouse owner bids them farewell. Quickly, she reads the letter, saying that she should just take as long as she needs, and assumes it is an extremely profitable deal. Soon, the couple ended up walking through the cities, seeing what it had to offer. Lenny was embarrassed and scratching his hair until Jun-sun caught his attention, thus making a small joke about how that fish was funny and looked grumpy, just like his companion. She became so irritated that she simply shoved that creature on her head while her eyes burned with fire. Soon, one of the vendors claimed this was a perfect dart game for a couple. And so, both began to play this simple game, thus bursting the balloons with extreme agility and precision, giving that girl a plush toy that our protagonist was happy to see she managed to get. She was wearing a smile of extreme happiness at that moment. And our protagonist, while taking the fish away, could only feel joy for giving her that happiness. Soon, the end of that day finally approaches. She claims that everything there tastes amazing, and her brother would surely love it. In the end, our protagonist knows that she lives with her mother and younger brother, and the reason she wants a promotion is to help her family. The girl promptly thanks him, saying that he really managed to find time just to be with her. In the end, the lady knows that a master of arms does not need help, especially from a low-ranked knight like herself. In the end, she would already be very grateful if she didn't die when she returned to the behemoth. But when she thinks of her family, she becomes anxious. And as she gets up, she assumes that on this day, she had a lot of fun without worrying about those things. In the end, she will never forget this, and thus she assumes that at their next meeting, they could go to the Empire of Loss. Our protagonist looks at her for a moment, listening to those words, thus tightening his fist and thinking about it. Soon he questions if they need to return to the behemoth, if she would stay there. However, the girl stops him at that moment, taking a leaf out of her hair and saying that she follows the orders she receives very well. For in the end, the Knights of the Metal Wolf never run from anything. Thus, our protagonist looks slightly concerned, knowing that he would have to tell her about her death if he continued. That night, we can then observe the dungeon atop the creature, known as the White Knight. The cavalry leader called for Isadora, saying that they knew there was a weapon there that could deal with the creature. However, nothing was said about the enormous amount of strange things that permeate there. The bearded man stepped forward, questioning what eggs those were that were there, and as he approached, he clearly noticed that inside them were several demons made with human parts. He quickly took a step back, saying that that form indicated they were clearly something that should not be approached, and suddenly, the creature completely tore through the shell of that egg, thus advancing towards the group all at once, realizing they were the Apostles of Lotus. At the docks of the port, the knight questioned why they were taking so long, and it was said not to worry, after all, the adventurer is with them, until one of the men stated that Margarita had returned and was finally landing. But only the player descended from her with extreme calm. Quickly, the Vice Master arrived in front of her, questioning what happened to the others, until suddenly, an item was shown that was the great emblem of the Master, which is a call for the knights to gather. Thus he understands that they have been summoned and asks to be guided while everyone prepares. Soon we can see another room where light permeates, and our protagonist observes all his new equipment equipped, where it is said that they must be free now. Upon opening his information window, he clearly notices that his reputation increased more than tenfold just with this. Thus he gets excited as he notices the armor disappear. His companion with him questions what happened. However, her reputation did not change. Then she notices that the parts just became invisible and that she feels no weight from it. Now we can see other people approaching, thanking him for giving them time. The woman questions if she would believe him if he said that a few minutes could decide the fate of this world. And our protagonist realizes that Iris is at this moment holding something of extreme value. This is the Hyper Jammer, a bracelet that allows resistance to the mental control of the demonic creature. But in the end, she is not giving this out of a good heart, and rather because currently, this woman is just a puppet at this moment. Quickly, the adventurer equipped the object on her arm. Our protagonist knows that the equipment ends up not working as it should, and something will happen to her soon. And in the end, stopping to think, his job is to guide the story back to the original path, and not change the parts he doesn't like, for this is all just a game. At this moment, everyone is ready, and the Vice Master warns that they have started to move. Our protagonist follows Roboto while it is said to start climbing above the ship, and Jinsun realizes that it has finally begun. What he longed for, which is the end of the fight against Lotus. At this moment, they will return to the behemoth to discuss their plans, as there are two destinations, the center of the sanctuary, and the ruins where the members fled to hide. Because of this, the huge group was divided into two, where the player will bring back the survivors from the ruins, while the other knights and our protagonist will pave the way to the final boss. Thus, we can clearly see one of the creatures being killed without any difficulty. It is said to keep firing, as the path will be clear with this. One of the creatures advanced quickly, saying to die in the name of their Lord Lotus. Our protagonist quickly warns to run, as he is about to do something. and so he makes a quick movement, cutting down the creatures that were coming towards the soldiers. Everyone is impressed by his terrifying speed at that moment. However, our protagonist hears a scream as another creature charges forward, going after one of the men who ends up being trapped and thus prepares to be killed. With a shout, the dagger flew towards his face at that moment to finish him off, but our protagonist was quick enough to destroy the creature with a simple teleport. It is said not to be cornered by these minions, and one of the girls realizes that this is the guy Lenny mentioned. The man thanks him, but it is said to be careful of the mental attacks that will begin from then on. In the end, the best way to overcome them is with sheer willpower, but now our protagonist has his own methods and ends up not realizing he has been caught. Thus, his own perception of reality was altered in an instant. The night watches, questioning what happened to him, and our protagonist in his mental world turns around, thus seeing the demon asking him to follow his words and become his servant. Quickly, the protagonist curses him in one go while naming him the 8th apostle, being called Lotus of the Long Legs. All he needs to do is stay calm and have nothing to fear, and he shouldn't be able to control all living organisms as he did on his home planet Solaris. Now he must use his inventory to counterattack. However, the creature questions how he knows about his former home. This demon never mentioned anything about it, yet this boy knows. And with that, the blonde realizes that the creature can read his mind. He quickly feels a headache as the creature continues to invade and see those so-called suts. In the end, our protagonist sees this world as if it were a gigantic program and questions whether it truly comes from another world. And while observing, our protagonist thinks he cannot let this creature read any more of his thoughts. However, he can feel immense pain as the demon asks him to answer its questions. With a scream, the creature announces that if he doesn't have the appropriate answer, it will ensure to rip off his head. In the end, he lived in a gray world and questions the so-called corruption, and our protagonist finally takes action, thus saying he will show what the true mind of a person is. And such information ends up entering the creature's brain at once, causing a massive shock. It ends up screaming in agony, questioning what kind of strange thoughts these are. Our boy finally frees himself and stops feeling that agonizing pain. And as he looks up, he thinks that the tide has turned in his favor, this being his chance. With his sword in hand, he asserts that he came from another world, so he knows quite a bit. At that moment, he even knows how to get rid of this place. The creature tries to learn more, but our protagonist asserts that it should no longer attempt to read his mind, or it will end its own life right there. Quickly, the octopus questions if he dares to bet in front of the great apostle, but our protagonist firmly states that it can think whatever it wants, since he has nothing to lose. Quickly, the creature then questions what he truly wishes to know. Thus, our protagonist asks if it would be the source of the corruption. The creature asserts that those words were seen in his mind, and there are some apostles who are contaminating things, like the so-called revolting delight. Our protagonist asserts that he is not talking about something physical. However, that is not its concern. Quickly, the blonde sees that it also does not know if the apostles are responsible, and thus questions what it is laughing about, where it is said that it should already know the answer in the end. For not even Namir, the great goddess, can deal with this, which could mean that if the problem truly comes from the apostles, then it means that a certain person is also involved, being the only one capable of doing this, called Hildur. Quickly, the blonde sighed, questioning why the most annoying one is the source of the corruption, but in the end, it's not as if he wasn't already sure. The creature quickly says that it is indeed fun to see him try to escape reality, and does not need to read his mind to deduce based on his face. Now that our protagonist has stopped to think, he questions whether Hildur, Sirocco, and Cassius also have the ability to read minds, or if even the abilities of those others are better than that of the demonic creature. With that, the octopus advanced, questioning how he dares to compare it to those idiots, especially underestimating them so much. In the end, Hilda is an idiot who plays with puppets, and Cassius has his sense as a warrior, and our protagonist realizes he has touched a wound. In the end, he cannot be arrogant enough to believe that he, Lotus, the ruler of the oceans, would be compared to those children. It is said that when he returns to the oceans, he will be able to invade their memories whenever he wants. Our protagonist realizes that Hilda really cannot read minds, which makes sense since she is better at controlling others strategically. In the end, if she could read minds, there would be no need for any of this, and even if Iris is on her side, she doesn't need to worry at the moment. Our protagonist reveals he has one more question. However, the people tell him to be quiet, saying it's time to answer. So he decides to ask what that box was that was seen. Our protagonist is also confused, but the creature informs him that it was captured in a box by countless people, even children, and Jin realizes he is being talked about on the phone. Then he sighs and states that he has no choice, and so he decides to tell it, since sooner or later he will be broken by the hands of adventurers for hundreds and thousands of years. The creature doubts and questions how he dares to speak of its fate, and guarantees that it will crush his body. Our protagonist holds his blade, saying that it can try that in vain, until suddenly the creature stops at that moment with a sigh. It announces that it is no longer time to play with the human, thus confusing him. In the end, he is a lucky human, and so he will let him leave with a warning. If he can leave this place, then he will ensure not to show what true destruction is. Our protagonist is confused at that moment, as he is being spared at once, and so he questions what it meant by not being the right time. With that, we can observe the adventurer's bracelet, which finally darkens at that moment and loses its effect. Soon he wakes up completely terrified. Thus he questions whether he has returned and how much time has passed. Quickly, a knight approaches calling for Fiona and saying that there is urgent news, since the adventurer has disappeared and Lenny is looking for them at this very moment. The woman states that they need to hurry immediately. But our protagonist runs as fast as possible, realizing that this is why the demon let him go. In the end, the hyperjammer of the muse ended up not working, which means it is being controlled by the demon. And if Lenny goes after them, then he will end up dying. He needs to hurry as fast as possible before something happens. But then, with heavy breathing, he questions what he might be doing in this situation. In the end, he is there to stop the corruption, and if he does that, it will be he who is causing it. And so he wonders if it is really worth letting this go. But behind him, as he was thinking, reality begins to break, thus opening a portal that scares him at that moment. Quickly, he sees someone coming out while recognizing at first glance since it is the player along with Iris. But he realizes that this time, she is not being controlled by Lotus and questions what is happening, until a man approaches saying that they managed to reach the behemoth. Our protagonist wonders who that might be at first glance. However, when he stops to think about his characteristics, the strong accent, and the sword at his waist, he then remembers one of the 4 masters of weapons and the time traveler being called Siren. This is the story of the future, where at level 70, this man will bring the adventurer along with Iris to an event that happened in the past. Although this was a dungeon, he never imagined that this kind of concept would actually occur, along with the regression. Soon they hear someone shout for the adventurer to stay extremely still. Our protagonist recognizes that as Linny's voice, where the samurai states that there she is. He becomes confused, and it is said that things will get complicated with the Lord of Time, so they must not touch anything from the past. This being the only exception to Lenny, who is inside. Our protagonist is impressed, questioning what they mean since they should not change the past, but rather watch what would happen. The blonde quickly thinks that this might end up being true corruption. Then starting to walk, he states he is not sure why, but they are planning to do something. He questions how he should resolve this, since the Lords of Time will get involved if he tries anything against these men. Thus we can see the wall receiving blow all at once. Lenny dodges these energy attacks with such agility alongside difficulty. She tells the adventurer to focus more and not let herself be controlled. The samurai approaches, saying that in the end, she is fine. Now all they need to do is start moving without noticing a shadow appearing out of nowhere. This being our protagonist who attacks them, however, the man is able to retaliate. He then questions what it is that is interrupting him, and thus realizes it is an apostle being controlled. Our protagonist claims he was not caught, and in the end, he does not know what is happening, but cannot let them do as they please. Now he needs to keep his identity hidden. However, the items become invisible. He tries to shout that this is a disguise, but the man advances once more, soon hitting him multiple times and forcing him to defend himself. In the end, he will be discovered, and if this continues, the Lords of Time will end up interrupting him. However, suddenly the fight continues without any intervention. Thus he questions why nothing is happening there. Soon he tells the player not to move, using a quick movement. The samurai questions if he truly dares to avert his gaze. Our protagonist is then able to dodge his strike with a precise teleport. The boy promptly extends his hand forward, calling upon the shadows that obey his command, soon using an area attack called Dark Delirium. Everyone can feel this extremely powerful blow and questions who this man could be. Our protagonist shouts as he uses his attack with maximum force, until he receives a blow to his head from Iris, who used the guitar. His head then starts to spout ketchup while confusion is visible. The woman holds him and then warns the adventurer and Siren to continue, for now is their chance to do what was being asked, since they must save Lenny as quickly as possible. This surprises our protagonist for hearing something so unexpected. Our protagonist remains confused and does not quite understand this. However, suddenly a trident is thrown at that moment, piercing Iris's chest and killing her in the process. Soon someone shouts for them to stop at that moment. Our protagonist recognizes them as Fiona and Dan who are there. He questions what is happening and especially why they attacked the woman. In the end, they were found, and Fiona tells them to get lost since they are completely crazy fanatics. Our protagonist is confused since he is sure that those fighting are not the same monsters from before. Thus confusion settles in his mind, and he questions what he should really do. Soon, the knight questions what our protagonist is doing at that moment. Since he must hurry as fast as possible to help Lenny in her plight, our protagonist stands completely still, without reaction and not knowing what to do, until the woman is hit by a shot that completely shatters her sword. Soon, the adventurer prepares to deliver the final blow to the girl at that moment. She continues with the same look of being possessed by the demonic being. Our protagonist then makes his final decision and resolves to intervene, thus running as fast as possible while pulling out his sword and calling for the girl he fell in love with. However, the arrow is already being prepared, and thus it is fired in the direction of that specific target. Lenny stood paralyzed, unable to know what to do, while our protagonist ran as fast as he could without using his teleport due to the emotional burden, until suddenly the sound of the breeze is heard at that moment while blood spills through the air. The energy of the arrow dissipates into the sky, and thus we can observe the damage done against that knight who is in love. Both knights advanced with imminent concern for the girl. The blonde was crying at that moment, unable to believe she lost a great friend that day, and our protagonist stood paralyzed with a dark expression, not knowing what to think. They shouted for Lenny non-stop while they could feel the sob caught in their throats. In the end, the cruel death of Lenny is a very important part of the story of this world. Thus, we can see that the player has finally returned to control of her character. That is a starting point that fuels the determination of the adventurers to stay on the right path and go after Lotus as quickly as possible. Everyone continues crying while the adventurer turns her back, ready for her objective. Our protagonist is sitting at that moment while the girl withdraws from there. He questions what the right path really is, since to do this, a person lost their life. Suddenly, the bodies of the two people who were there began to emit black smoke. This catches the attention of our protagonist as he realizes the truth. Since Sira and news from the future never truly existed, in the end, they were just fanatics, which meant being an illusion he believed due to seeing them emerge from the time rift. Everyone was just as he remembered and just as he kept in his memory. Soon he recalls that mental world where he sensed his mind was being read. And so he paused to reason that he couldn't let this continue. That's how he ruined everything since the demon kept messing with his head, and especially using his memories. The reason the fanatics resembled a group from News of the Future, and the reason they asked to save the girl, was because that demonic being had been toying with him from the start. Soon a sound is heard amidst the wall that reverberates. Responsible for this, our protagonist plunged his hand while calling for Lotus, and thus he said that this impure being was truly the corruption of this place. With this in mind, he commanded it to wait, as he would ensure to chop that cursed octopus into pieces. Soon, we can see the center of the ruins of the dungeon located at the second column. The mollusk continued attacking while the cavalry leader defended himself, and he admitted that he was difficult to cut while being called a useless human. Since so far only two were trying to stop him at that moment, however, they were nothing to do so. The leader questions if he isn't being a bit optimistic, since he is fighting against two masters at that moment. But as he advances, the creature immediately tells him to be quiet, until suddenly the adventurer approaches with a shot using her life skill. The cavalry leader gets excited about that, telling them to continue since she is very late. The creature is confused at first glance, as it doesn't understand how she is there. In the end, its trap ended up failing, and it questions if it will really die to this girl. But then, it bursts into huge laughter while telling her to come at it with everything. It doesn't have to accept this fate or anything like that. Soon the archer fired several arrows in succession, thus hitting the core where that creature resided. She quickly said she would kill the adventurer no matter what happened, thus trapping her with its tentacle and ready to crush her. However, suddenly it turned into smoke all at once. That scared the people who questioned how that was possible. However, the blazing debut is an extremely effective skill that allows her to go to the creature's rear. The cavalry leader gets excited since that was indeed a teleport, which is extremely impressive. The beast quickly curses her once again, as it advanced, wishing for her death. However, the archer was faster, thus using the moon chaser to finish off the creature. Soon the place where it resided began to collapse while it was said that there was no way left. The leader then assumes that it's finally over amidst the laughter. Then the bearded one states that the adventurer arrived in time while it was said that they would be fine without her. But then he praises her for making a huge contribution. However, suddenly the octopus continued spuching, which scared the cavalry master. And thus the beast asked not to make it laugh with those futile actions. Soon a huge shockwave spread throughout the island, and even the sky surrounding it distanced itself with that heavy aura. Everyone then knelt weakly, questioning what this could be. The leader then questioned what he was doing at that moment, until everyone's eyes were possessed just like their minds. Quickly, that heavy weapon was finally dropped to the ground, while the creature's laughter could be heard indicating its victory. For now, the three most powerful members were under its dominion at that moment. In the end, the octopus kept laughing since fate could really be changed and the great Lord Lotus would always be eternal, until it was surprised to hear someone questioning if that was really funny. Our protagonist finally arrived with an extremely badass pose, and thus he claimed that this was the end of that stupid creature. Finally, the body of the creature was becoming visible. Our protagonist then questioned if it really believed that was so fun, since the lives of people are not something that can be controlled so easily. Quickly, the creature questioned how he managed to move where it was said that he is just a useless one. However, that doesn't matter, since he will ensure to brainwash this otherworldly human anyway. However, that was completely blocked by our boy, all at once. Thus, he ends up throwing something at the beast that was in front of him. Our protagonist questions why he should care about that, since he can just use his powers to know. Thus, the creature reviews its memories once again, getting scared at that moment, since that is clearly a resistance potion used by itself. That was a special request from our protagonist, who clearly asks Kana to do it. In the end, he tried to copy the abilities of the Hyperjammer since she can block visions and brainwashing but not telepathy. With the tentacles unleashed, he advanced while calling him a brat, thus questioning how he dares to use such a trick against him. In the end, that is ridiculous since he only gained an advantage and now has several tentacles to entangle him even without a mental wash. Our protagonist then pulled out his sword, saying he was getting tired of that voice since they would end this as quickly as possible. Thus, we can clearly see the moon shining in the sky at that moment, until the octopus was struck with extreme force by the boy. He then questioned what was happening to his tentacles at that moment, and the creature screamed for him to be quiet while attacking, but our protagonist teleported quickly using his abilities, soon appearing behind the creature ready to eliminate it. However, he ended up being struck by surprise by one of the tentacles coming in his direction. In the end, he could read all its tricks since his fifth combo now is nothing special. Thus, he continued attacking while questioning how he intends to fight someone who can easily read his movements. And our protagonist then smiled at that moment, questioning if he can really do that. soon using a large wave at that moment while teleporting numerous times, thus using a black cross slash next in the other direction of the creature. It thinks he is trying to draw its attention for a stealth attack, and in the end, what it is thinking will not work. If the octopus reads his mind, all it needs to do is ensure he cannot react. The mollusk already knew that, and it was not bad, but it is still very simple, and no matter what it does, all it needs is a target to aim at. Thus, it clearly managed to predict our protagonist planning to attack its rear. Soon it turned with its tentacle ready to kill him that way. However, it only hit the wind at that moment. Thus, it was surprised when an attack struck from behind all at once. It questions how that was possible since it was sure it saw his mind. The blonde promptly thought that the next one was precisely from the right. The octopus then turned, going with its tentacle in that direction. However, it was again struck from the opposite side all at once. It questions how that is possible, since it is attacking from the opposite direction of what it thinks. And so it resolves to see clearly into his mind, where it sees some strange buttons. It questions these symbols that are appearing in the boy's mind. Thus our protagonist questions what happened since he thought he could see its mind. Then he executed numerous transports, cutting off the limbs of that huge octopus. However, the creature finally managed to see a gap among all that, soon advancing with its tentacle towards one of the teleports, striking him from behind as a surprise. Our protagonist, confused, could only scream in pain until he fell to the ground, frightened while the creature announced that it understood the commands, since it seems to be a type of spell that combines abilities, and now it fought the commands instead of the ability itself. At that moment, the octopus ensured it memorized all of them, and in the end, it took a good while to boast while reading his mind. Then it attacked our protagonist, who was promptly smashed against the ground. Soon it repeated, this time lifting him with an uppercut, and thus a barrage of numerous attacks was executed against our protagonist, who was now injured and breathing heavily, until the creature advanced once more, making the ketchup gush while laughing. But our protagonist got up again, questioning the command inputs, until he was struck again, thus losing his sword. He had said that this would be his end. However, there was nothing left to lean on now. The boy could only curse while it was said that he was irritated because of a girl. However, the only person responsible for that was himself for not thinking better in all situations. Quickly, our protagonist stood up with visible rage once again, thus preparing to strike it with his sword, imbued with aura. The creature opened its eye with extreme anger, announcing that this was about to end at that moment. Soon it pierced our protagonist's chest all at once using its tentacle. The same one laughed while repeatedly calling him a fool. However, our protagonist remained alive and was regenerating, thus managing to completely sever that distorted limb. It fell to the ground once more, but didn't seem tired at all. The creature wondered how that was possible since it felt its attack land. Yet our protagonist, engulfed in rage, announced that he would kill it no matter what happened. And so the demonic creature questioned what dirty trick it was using this time. But the boy didn't respond and simply passed through those limbs in one go. In the end, it made no sense since he was completely ignoring its attacks and still surviving. He was unable to understand what was happening since he needed to find out no matter what. Thus, the octopus began to review the memories, questioning what the plan could be, since there must be a secret hidden somewhere for that. Until suddenly he found what he was looking for, and as he observed, he questioned what it was since he was sure it should be the secret. Soon he looked at the statistics. After all, one of the abilities at level 10 granted him invisibility. However, the creature, even with that, was unable to understand what was occurring, since our protagonist simply advanced like a demon, cutting through all the tentacles. He said it was nonsense since that shouldn't be possible for an amateur. Superior armor along with invisibility was just nonsense to him. However, our boy finally appeared, clearly demonstrating his rage. The creature tried to plead for mercy at that moment. However, our protagonist confessed to Lenny that he wasn't sure what to do or how to do the right thing, and thus he asked for forgiveness for becoming enraged, and especially for doing something he might regret. However, he would ensure that its death was not in vain, not even that the corruption would continue spreading since it would be completely erased by his presence at that moment. In the end, he was able to gather all his energy deep within that special weapon of his, thus forming a gigantic black blade that would be used. Then he charged forward in one go as fury took over. The creature could observe that strike approaching, not understanding the size and power it possessed, and thus it was completely split in half by the darkness itself. This was the definitive black cut, something that completely surpassed that island, devastating all the vegetation in its path. In addition to forming the gigantic crater with it, the leaves flew through the skies due to the energy possessed, and a huge cut in the earth was made and shown to us by our enraged protagonist. Thus he dispelled that blade while saying goodbye to the person who truly had won his heart in this world. After all that fighting, the rain finally began to fall, soon weighing down the atmosphere even more after an unexpected death. The creature was shown to be breathing extremely heavily, and thus we see the damage our protagonist ended up causing it. In the end, the system settings and destiny are truly strange things to think about when it's just a mere puppet. And so, Jinsung approached with a heavy step. Amid laughter, he questioned if everything was all right with that since he should meet his end at the hands of the adventurer, which means he is committing corruption. Then he decided to say that it was no different from anything else that happened since he is just a puppet continuing to chase chance. But the blonde was already tired of hearing that, and thus prepared his final blow while listening, thus completely eliminating the creature that died at that moment, soon freeing the minds of the other group members who faced him, With their hands on their heads, they questioned what had suddenly happened since they saw strange things while being controlled. However, upon facing the adventurer, it became clear that she was responsible for this. Both were incredulous since she probably attacked him after breaking free from his control. And the final trace of the battle was solely made by him in the end. Our protagonist was recovering at that moment while the girl received all the congratulations for her deeds. Then he sighed since this was the right path to follow. Soon we can see a forward post where it was said that the ship Margarita was approaching to take the injured first. The knight assumed that the atmosphere was indeed horrible. However, her captain stated that it was nothing serious. In the end, it turned out to be a great stroke of luck that the adventurer ended up coming with them at that moment. However, suddenly the blonde girl finally approached, thus calling the attention of the two masters who stared at her from afar. Seeing thus the body of another person, we already know whose it is. The vice promptly ran since it was indeed a person important to him, and the adventurer remained quiet since it was she who ended up causing this outcome. But our protagonist stood behind a tree with his fist clenched, still in pain. Thus, the rain fell once again from the sky. Lenny was temporarily placed beside the camp along with the other bodies. However, after her death, she received the promotion to knight that she had longed for. In the end, even though they had suffered losses, the captain suggested they celebrate their victory to avoid a heavy atmosphere. The woman tries to say she doesn't want to be impassive, yet questions whether he doesn't feel guilty for the deaths. But it is said that sympathy for the death of a knight is one thing after the battle, and in the end, this only means dishonor for someone who fought with all their honor. Our protagonist had heard that line of dialogue several times while playing, but this time he could feel it was being said directly to him. Soon the man admits that the atmosphere is terrible even after defeating an apostle. Thus he decides to take a look at Lotus's body to ensure he isn't faking his death or something like that. And our protagonist knows he is lying because the true purpose is to absorb the power of the body to create a weapon of devastation. In the end, this is the correct course that must be protected since he cannot intervene in the story in any way, even if this ends up bringing something bad to the world he is living in. In the end, the story of the Behemoth chapter finally came to a close, and we can then observe a person putting on the apostle's mask. This being Sharon, who assumes it is strange for someone to see with something like that. Our protagonist glances sideways while thinking a bit, since no one would think that this would be treated as real equipment. Thinking about it, there have never been certain items like this that can only be obtained once. He learned several things since he could obtain items just like in the game, and others by taking them from bodies. This is extremely useful information, and thus Sharon asks if he brought anything else. But that simple touch provoked a scream from our protagonist, who quickly shrank back and assumed he might have recovered with a potion. However, his muscles still hurt extremely. In the end, due to the super armor, the effects after the fight continue to be a problem. He cannot tell her the truth. However, everything happened as he wanted, plus he got the letter through corruption. Thus, he decides to question what he should take care of this time. Sharon assumes that he has changed more than expected since before he was nobody. However, his words gained enormous weight. Thus, she conjures a small piece of paper in her hands using her magic, and ends up saying that due to his abilities, she will formally recruit him for her guild. Our protagonist observes the page floating at that exact moment. Thus, the rain finally passes outside. The young man with claws assumes he has finally signed, and then asks if she could give him the payment immediately, to which it is said yes, since the contract was sealed. Quickly, she questions where he is going at that moment, to which it is said that he needs to check something and will return in a few days, which makes her question if he is just running away with the gold at that moment. But our protagonist just gives a light laugh, telling her not to worry, for he already has a reason to give his best at that moment. However, he did not know that his plan would fail, for the rain ended up destroying the path to Elvengard, which is the forest he wanted to go to. In the end, he needs to find Linus the blacksmith for something important. Thus, he wonders if he should ask for help and take Margarita to navigate there. However, his companion promptly asks to take that potion. Our protagonist questions what it is, which surprises the woman for not understanding, and thus, he says that before he drinks, he needs to understand something that he does not end up hearing. Thus, he disappears all at once, leaving her with a scared expression. Our boy then falls to the ground at that moment, letting his potion drop. He admits it hurt a lot while looking around, realizing he has finally just arrived in Elvengard. In the end, it was unexpected that Sharan would end up giving him a teleportation potion. After all, they have a level restriction and are yellow in color. But then our protagonist finally ends up finding Linus, whom he was looking for. Thus, the old man questions how he is and mainly comments on how boring it has been since Syria left. He then approaches, asking how the young man has been these last few days, and especially if he managed to help that friend he wanted to save. Our protagonist then remains silent at that moment, recalling a scene of Lenny smiling at the same. He soon sighs, saying there's no longer any reason to worry about her in that situation. The old man quickly understands and questions why he came since he doesn't seem to want to share the news. Then he is surprised to hear that he wants a new sword made. He questions what happened to the blade that was given to him, where it is said that it ended up being stolen. The man quickly understands and asks what it would be, and especially if there is a material, and Jimsum questions if he won't end up running away after seeing this. And Linus tries to say that there is no hesitation about his work until he takes a blatant hit to his face. The old man falls back while our protagonist apologizes since he didn't have much control over the inventory panel. On the ground, the blacksmith quickly questioned what that was shown, where it is said to be some cut tentacles of Lotus, thus frightening him immensely. Our protagonist says that many things have happened recently, and therefore asks for a sword, to which the man questions how he is supposed to make that. Our protagonist then understands since he thinks that it is too much for him to handle. Thus he assumes that only the best blacksmith of all would be able to deal with this item. Soon Linus gets up and tells the arrogant boy to wait at that exact moment, and thus says that he never runs from any challenge, especially when it comes to making a weapon. Our protagonist is laughing because he knows this man's personality who would accept anything to prove his worth. Thus, he ends up mocking a bit and saying that this must be easier than cutting a cake, where it is said that he is correct. Our protagonist assumes it is perfect, since as long as he has money, he will be able to buy some potions, and once he returns, carry out his plans. However, he realizes that he got there using a teleportation potion. Thus, he questions how he will return since the path is blocked until someone ends up appearing, being his boss, who assumes that he should have listened more before leaving so suddenly. In the end, she thought well, and thus brought him something to drink, since he is lucky that she knew the coordinates of the last potion that was used. Now both will return to the guild as quickly as possible, and she questions what is wrong, where she assumed that the teleportation potions she knew were all yellow. Thus she questions if the woman made any mistake in this manufacturing. This completely irritates the maid, who questions how he dares to compare this beautiful and organic material with those fake potions sold. Quickly she says that she no longer wishes to take him back, but our protagonist promptly apologizes. Soon we can see the corridors of the Mage Guild at that moment, where our protagonist finally opened the door to see something that was meant for him, being the new room prepared just for himself. The mage assumes it is still quite empty, and thus says that she must have time to prepare some things, and will ensure to give him what he needs. Soon a person approaches saying that the item that was requested has just been completed. A protagonist believes it was indeed a gift, and thus says he didn't need that. However, it was just a plaque placed on his wall saying that he was part of the Emergency Response Committee for Abnormal Events. Our protagonist questions what that was, to which it is said that this is the mark of his new job. Jimson promptly complains. After all, it seemed to have been made by an old woman who didn't know how to maim anything, which irritates his boss even more. Soon a small argument occurred at that moment, and the woman ended up coming out on top since that was already finalized, so she could just give up. In the end, he will be operating for the guild as a matchel tracker, so he must ensure to follow his contract. Our protagonist then thinks of the next danger that comes, since after the events of the behemoth, the metastasis coming from another apostle will be approaching. This is a phenomenon that happens where the dimension ends up separating and occurs due to an unknown nature after the kidnapping of a certain person. However, the true reason the apostles are making this move is because of Hildur, since she has enough power to cause a break in the dimension where demonic creatures can end up entering us. Her true purpose is to carry out the Genesis, where according to the prophecy, she can kill adventurers to thus sacrifice them and make the demonic plan resurface. In the end, she is just an idiot for believing in this prophecy. However, her power is truly the problem since there is no chance. First of all, he needs to focus on a way to gain more strength. Thus, he questions Sharon if she knows how to make healing potions, which is surprising. In the end, what he desires is something that can combat the corruption of spirit and mainly fight something that Sharon understands as a plague. Quickly, she asks where this will begin, and our protagonist reveals it to be Ophelia in the kingdom of Fenner. The mage is immensely surprised by what is being said. In the end, what is approaching comes directly from the city underground where the dark elves live. Our protagonist then apologizes. However, it has already begun, and so we can see this kingdom that is being ravaged by the plague. A man shouts that everyone needs to go back inside immediately, for the city is being contaminated because of these humans who are nefarious beings. One of the mages questions how they dare to attack their kingdom using these methods while claiming he will ensure his revenge. In the end, all their forces have already gathered at the door that leads to the surface, and now they are all walking towards a true war. Some time then passes, and soon we return to the forest, where our protagonist has just arrived and sees a frightening scene before him, this being the blacksmith who is currently engulfed in flames, while he raises his hammer ready to finish, thus striking for the last time his most recent creation. Then he sighed, claiming it was complete while feeling proud. Our protagonist realized it is the discontinued item from the giant tentacle of Lotus, and thus thinks it is the same as in the promotional images. Quickly, the blacksmith questioned what he meant by that, and it was said that there was only one thing he would like to ask at this moment. With that, the blacksmith decided to question why he wanted the mold at this exact moment. Our protagonist then thinks he can gain a skill and change the appearance of an item, and thus claims he will make a lot of money with it. Soon we return to the city, where someone appears to be tired. This adventurer we already know assumed that the daily missions and raids have been very boring, until suddenly looking up, there was a message that caught his attention, since the idea is something he knows at this exact moment. Our protagonist continues shouting and repeating his message, since at level 35, there is the weapon of the giant tentacle of Lotus, which besides being rare is an incredible item. And suddenly this man ended up whispering privately to our protagonist, who ends up shouting. He laughs at that moment and questions what is being sold, while our protagonist assumed he would never get used to it. This blacksmith watched him with doubt, and our protagonist wondered how to use it the same way. As soon as he understood, he started sending messages, and the person ended up saying they would buy this weapon for 8 million gold. Our protagonist Ben got excited and assumed where his location was while realizing the call had ended. And from behind him, someone caught his attention at once, this being a giant dog that appeared with a teleport, while saying he was there to check what he had in his hands. Our protagonist quickly understood he had just changed his main character to buy this item. Quickly, Jimson questioned what this pink aura was that permeated his weapon, where it was said he had enhanced it more than 13 times. The boy was then surprised. After all, most people stop at 12 due to the excessive cost it incurs. But he ended up saying that it might be worth it since this is his main character, which is contradicted afterward. It is then said that he only did this because he was curious about certain classes in the end, and thus questioned why his weapon was over 13. Where, in a heavy tone, the dog ends up responding that it is because paint is a very cool and beautiful color. Jim Sung then is surprised and hesitates for a moment. In the end, he is absolutely insane and crazy, and thus decides to follow this path to complete the trade. Soon it is completed, and our protagonist finally receives all the gold. The dog, on the other hand, keeps the weapon and thinks it's amazing since it also has the same aura. He believes it is incredibly cute and thus claims he has something else, soon handing a gift to our boy, who ends up getting startled. After all, this is a true creature egg, which is explained to be a kind of pet found in dungeons. Besides being very rare, they can take on more diverse forms. Thus, he becomes completely excited because that was exactly what he wanted while claiming he loved these crazy people. The dog promptly said he had a perfect one to deliver to him, and thus a small lotus octopus just appeared in his hands. Our protagonist at that moment was paralyzed as some memories came to his mind, and so completely irritated, he threw the creature against a nearby tree. In the end, he didn't think it through, and the poor little creature was crying at that moment. The wolf continued to assume that it was extremely cute, and the little star still thanked him for the gift. Soon he held it, saying he had nothing more to say, and in the end, it wasn't his fault for being born that way. The dog found it funny how he spoke to his creatures and questioned whether he really didn't want to join his guild. Our protagonist said he would pass while the other assumed it must be because of the rumors, and then admitted he wasn't close to certain people. The blonde boy asked if it was a famous guild, but had no idea what had been presented the last time he had the chance to join that guild. In the end, if he changed his mind, he would make sure to let him know, thus going to the Mage Guild once again. Our protagonist then called for Sharon as he entered, until he realized she wasn't there, but a letter had been left for him. In the end, the lady didn't want to believe it. However, what she ended up telling him was true, for she received several messages saying that her hometown was suffering from an epidemic where the dead were coming back to life. The most annoying part of all this was that the Dark Elves believed it was an attack from humans. Because of this, the place where the two regions met became a battlefield that would explode very soon. Before the situation spread, the adventurers were ordered by the Queen to investigate, and during this, they found evidence of a possible cure for it. Because of this, she ended up taking one of the best alchemists and decided to leave this letter for him as a way to alert him about it. Finishing reading, our boy began to run as fast as possible since that meant someone had already started this mission historically. Thus, he opened the door, finding Syria in front of him while assuming he should get there as quickly as possible. He soon remembered that he had joined the Mage Guild after the Castle of Skies. The girl then recognized him from that dungeon where he introduced himself as Jimsung, a rookie member of the Mage Guild. Then they ended up overhearing the conversation where the Queen didn't seem to understand the situation very well since a war might end up occurring. In the end, she chose to send adventurers instead of official members, which is extremely ridiculous since they are just mercenaries. Syria then stepped forward, assuring that she was sure the adventurer would handle it since he saved Elvengard previously. The mage said he heard stories of them eliminating some goblins. However, he didn't believe they would be useful in this type of situation. Our protagonist got irritated at that moment. However, the girl said she trusted him because she was there and saw everything personally. Thus, she assumed that by giving her blessings to the adventurers and to all of them, she said everything would turn out fine. In the end, everyone could feel a light aura covering their bodies at that moment, as if this girl were actually a goddess sent to save the world. Jinsun quickly ran out while saying he shouldn't waste time there. Soon, some time passed, and we could see the footprints in the heavy earth. Our protagonist continued walking with extreme calm, while his little creature stayed on top of his head as if it had ensured that its nest remained there. And thus he arrived at the Principality of Belmire, where he was on the edge of his territory. The alchemist was surprised since the situation seemed really bad. However, he was very happy because they managed to find a cure very quickly and even had the ingredients they needed. He questioned how he knew he should prepare this, and the woman was unsure how to respond while our protagonist appeared. He soon called for Sharan once again, thus assuming he came there to help her. Not realizing this was a completely frightening scene, she prepared a spell, questioning what that would be while it was said that she still hadn't named this little creature. In the end, she didn't want to know, and revealed that things were getting worse than she had thought and asked where the adventurer was. It was said that he went down the path to the kingdom of the Dark Elves blocked by the undead and went there to clear the way for the other troops. Our protagonist realized that the story was making good progress since the first dungeon had already been completed. It's almost like the adventure is completing faster than planned, where the hero of the catacomb, called Lungal, will be freed. Thanks to this plague, this warrior ends up returning, and he will be the one responsible for stopping the epidemic as the main key. Our protagonist quickly questions if he can help and thus asks for an antidote. The woman hands it to him. However, he shouldn't worry. After all, our protagonist is the person who knows that place best in the end. In that eerie location, a toxic air was visibly spreading throughout the environment. The creatures were quickly torn apart by our protagonist, who was there in front using his new sword while the creatures screamed. He was impressed by how powerful it was, and thus he laughed and thought, after all, these ghouls are no longer on his level since his physical damage has already surpassed 428. Soon the creatures prepared for a joint attack, not noticing something coming from the sky. Our protagonist laughed, already knowing what it was. It was a large tentacle that quickly pierced several of the creatures at once. In the end, there was a special ability in this item since there is a 2% chance of it spawning one of Lotus's legs. That tentacle quickly dealt with the creatures with extreme ease and gigantic damage, thus generating a destroyed terrain while our protagonist remained calm. In the end, there are two reasons that explain these monsters: the aura of the apostle and the death dragon that is found there. The Dark Elves are truly unfortunate to have this, and this weapon of theirs is incredibly useful, questioning why their companion seems so proud of it. In the end, he is already close to the pillars where the boss room is indicated to be. Thus he began to run, realizing that it was finally Lungel's tomb. Soon he approached calmly, not noticing that there was nothing there. For inside, that coffin was empty, and without anyone. He realized that the player is faster than he had thought, and the Time Lords did not stop, which means that the corruption has not occurred yet. And if the knight is not truly corrupted, then the worst possibility will end up being that the Death Dragon was born with that, being the most powerful monster of Ophelia called Sparazzi. In the end, this was supposed to be a great tomb of a hero. However, there is no treasure there. He assumes there are only a few gold coins and some rotten food, and tells his little creature not to store these items in its inventory. On the other hand, the little creature ends up screaming at that moment when our protagonist questioned if it wanted to be eaten. Soon we can see the entrance to the Elven Kingdom where someone finally arrives. The first hero says that they are completely surrounded, and in the end, it seems that the soldiers were waiting for them at that moment. Quickly, someone approaches, saying that they are very confident in their vision, and thus, the elder says he heard that the intruders were really trying to enter the city through that path full of undead. In the end, they made a true path to there, and assume that this passage will be used by their troops during their attack route. He thanks for the hard work of those people to get there. However, the blonde says it is not the time to start a war since they should at least listen to the adventurer and thus question who it would be. In the end, he is the Dragon Slayer and the one who completed the 7 missions given by the goddess Venus. His name is Lungel, the true descendant of the elves. The elder promptly tries to say that this is impossible. After all, he is an ancient knight from many eras ago until someone tells him to stop. This newcomer assumed that this appearance was not uncommon, and she assumed that without a doubt that was her true lord who tamed there. The elder even tries to say that this was just an illusion, but the woman knew it was impossible to control an ancestor who was dead, and suddenly, someone ends up running at that moment, assuming it was an extreme emergency. Soon they questioned what was happening, where the man took a bit of air. Then a gigantic scream was heard, causing the walls of the place to tremble. A heavy aura of malignant green approached, soon taking over a boss room where it was said that the true Death Dragon had destroyed its own seal to free itself once and for all. Meanwhile, our protagonist continued to run desperately down the stairs. That was a secret passage he knew, and thus he said that this sound meant that Sparazzi had just been revived. The adventurer and Lungel will continue until they reach the Dark Elves to kill the dragon, which means they need to get there as quickly as possible. However, on their way, they encounter various creatures that catch their attention. He assumes that this is a nuisance and then draws his sword, saying he has no time for any of that. Meanwhile, we can see the dragon's tomb where the creature roared fiercely, thus assuming they were all fools since this seal wouldn't be able to hold him for long. Soon he began to attack while the adventurer was able to dodge it with ease, then using an attack called Shadow of the Serpent to make several cuts. The creature made of bones promptly used its green breath, shouting at her while belittling her. However, it did not notice something coming from above like a flash of light, thus cutting it in one go and literally taking its head to the sky. Everyone was excited, believing they had defeated this vile creature. However, suddenly it lunged at the adventurer, who took the hit and was thrown far away, crashing face first into the wall. The dragon acknowledged that it was impressive. However, these attacks couldn't even scratch its immortal body. Everyone screamed in terror, saying it wouldn't stop regenerating and they had no chance to counterattack. With that, the dragon charged at the woman, telling her to die like the fool she is, then unleashing a massive explosion due to its immense strength. However, it was blocked by the hero, who thanked for all the fun, and especially for being able to see his descendants and help them. But this was the last thing he will be able to do for all of them. In the room outside, our protagonist continued running with heavy breaths. He assumed that the boss's pillars were close, which means they had reached the tomb. However, suddenly a huge light emerged from that door. This was the final attack of that honored elven warrior who charged at the dragon. Everyone shouted his name while pleading for him not to end up dying. But his existence was torn apart just to make an attack on the creature's core. And as he vanished, he begged her not to miss this chance to strike. The dragon cursed that damned elf, questioning what he had done to its body. And the adventurer took advantage of that to attack it at that moment. Then using her strike, capable of reverberating the skies, the dragon felt immense pain while the adventurer simply fell to the ground. Her body was already completely cut, and thus she called for her once more, soon saying they were all fools for believing it was the end. However, its body finally fell to the ground while the woman farmed aura at that moment. It was questioned whether they really managed to win, and the elder assumed it was not regenerating. In the end, everyone there was able to defeat this dragon, and the adventurer along with Lord Lungel is truly incredible. But our protagonist watched from afar, wondering if it really had ended this way. Soon we can see the royal capital of the Kingdom of Finis located in Underfoot, where the Dark Elves live. In the end, they defeated the Death Dragon, and some of the undead disappeared. However, the plague continues to spread out there. Quickly, the Elder states that the plague continues to spread, which could mean that this is still the fault of the humans who are plotting something. The Queen tries to say that this story is getting old. However, the man warns that this is a decision made by the kingdom and especially by the citizens living there. With the plague and the dragon's seal having been undone, the humans were able to meet with Lord Lungal and stop all of this. Moreover, they still have an antidote developed before arriving there, so it can't be just any coincidence. The Queen pauses to think for a moment while it is said that there is an easier way to gain their trust. She assumes it would be very complicated since they might end up leaving their side at that moment. In the end, the situation would be much more difficult if she believed they were truly innocent. That's why they ended up sending that adventurer to the darkest parts of the city in search of better understanding what is affecting everyone. For he must understand well what exists at the bottom of this city. This is the sixth apostle called Delazier, also known as the Plague. This is the reason for all this disease, although it is not important at the moment. Since the region of Ophelia has practically been completed while the corruption has not appeared, yet the story continues to follow its natural path. He questions whether he should change the area issue for the story, yet something is still wrong. For now, he needs to run as fast as possible until he reaches the underground city of Noirfera. The first thing we can see as soon as we arrive is the body of one of the dwarves who lived there. In the end, the altar is completely broken, and it seems he has reached the right place. This dungeon is called the Tyrant King's Palace, where all the dwarves live, and the creatures protect this place with everything they have, which is around and on the way to their city. The story is that the Dark Elves want to take control of the city, however the dwarves do not wish to give up the surrounding area. In the end, they are intelligent but difficult to talk to, so they assume anyone is an intruder and attack immediately. And in the game, they are considered dungeon monsters for this reason, and now the adventurer must have taken care of most of them. The reason they refuse to leave is quite obvious. Thus, the little creature accompanying our protagonist ends up bumping into him, and it makes him activate his quick movement ability to run as fast as possible. He quickly calls for the creature, aiming at Taco to run faster. It gets confused. However, its nickname comes precisely from takoyaki. Soon the boy stops suddenly, startled, for he has just seen a gigantic golden statue, with a real reason for them not to leave, since this place hides all the treasure they possess. In the end, he completely forgets about the settings and questions what this is. He soon realizes he can touch it with his own hands, just as he can also incorporate it into his inventory all at once. And at that moment, the gold was accepted and stored in the blonde's memory. Our protagonist then laughs, calling for Taco and saying they will be rich from then on. He soon tells it to grab as much as possible since he has no idea how much it is worth. He is making snow angels in the coins out of sheer happiness. Thus, he admits he is thinking of not even going back home now that he has all this. In the end, he could really live there without problems, but some memories come to his mind, and so he assumes it is a wrong idea while thinking he has gone too far. Suddenly, a scream is heard, forcing him to hide, this being the adventurer who uses a cutting impact at that moment. The dwarf who was killed weighed on his conscience, knowing that his gold would go to her hands. A person then approaches, saying it is a big surprise, since it seems these creatures have really kept a good amount for survival. That is incredible. However, they must keep moving. Our protagonist recognizes her as a meme, a guide chosen by the Elven Elder. Thus, Junsun quickly states that they came by a different path, using his jump while assuming they will follow. However, suddenly a certain sound can be heard coming from underground, and our protagonist upon landing also notices a tremor, which confuses him, and he questions what it could be. Until suddenly, a large hole appeared out of nowhere. His face was scared as he fell toward the abyss. Quickly, his companion followed him at that moment, trying to save his life. However, both ended up falling into the darkness. Our vision then shifts to another place full of darkness, where a strange creature walks through the streets of the city. Its steps are deliberate as it emits a heavy breath. He questioned at that moment who it was. Mainly, he did not understand why he was there, so he tried to reason. But soon an image of Hildur came to his mind suddenly, making him widen his eyes at once as the corrosive acid dripped from his body. He just remembered that this was part of the entire plan of that apostle, and thus he assumed he would ensure the corruption of this planet entirely, just because of this woman. At that moment, we can observe the surroundings of the city, where that black aura spread until it was stopped by something. The adventurer stared as the creature presented itself as the illusion of disease. It is merely a vision of the future destruction that will come, for the lands contaminated with its saliva will be completely permeated by the smell of death. It is said to wait, for he being Delazai, the Black Plague will ensure to bring them the end. Thus, both end up finishing the report on what happened at the location. The Elder promptly realizes that this creature is the real cause of the most recent events. And thus, the Queen assumes that everything is occurring just as it was said. By this Partamancer who just arrived there to help. Its only purpose is to resolve the misunderstanding they have with humans, and now that they have seen the apostles, they must understand the magnitude of this creature's true power. Delisi is something that destroys everything that comes near, and for the good of Arad, they must eliminate this creature. After that, the Elven Kingdom agreed to join forces with the alliance formed by the humans. The adventurer left as quickly as possible to reach the location of North Mire. Thus we can see the green city of Grozny being attacked by something. The creatures advanced with the plague disease within them. Everyone shouted to stop them, for they cannot let them enter their home. In the end, there is a large number, and they cannot continue like this alone. So they call for Michelle, who quickly prepares a spell, thus launching her projectiles that hit the creatures, stunning them at that moment. It is said that they need to hold on a little longer since they cannot lose this city. After all, it is a sanctuary for those called ciphers. In the end, everyone there was born with different abilities, and for that reason, they were called mistakes by others. This place called Grozny was the only one that allowed them to live in peace. However, if they lose it, they will have to return to discrimination. This person questions what is happening since the dead bodies return, becoming more animalistic and devoid of will or awareness. However, they are doing everything in their power to stop this infection as quickly as possible, but they do not know how long this will take. Quickly, the woman realizes that something managed to cross the barrier, and thus she asks to take care of this flank while she checks it out. She runs as fast as possible, questioning what could have caused that, until she reaches the location where she is startled at first sight. And thus she questions what this scene unfolding before her could be. For a human has just arrived there and eliminated the creatures. Our protagonist had thought he would die after falling into that golden tunnel. However, he was able to escape due to the ability of the giant tentacle on his sword. In the end, he ended up being too late since the story of that area had already concluded. But for now, he was able to buy some time due to the teleportation potion, unlike the adventurer who will have to continue on foot. This is the first dungeon of the northern city called Grozny, and it seems he did this just in time. Thus, he assumes he will have to take the lead to ensure everything goes well until someone ends up calling him. The girl then questions how he managed to get there, where he is recognized as one of the ciphers, being called Michelle Monaghan. It is said that the outside is full of the sick and infected. So how did he get there when our protagonist said he was just wanting to investigate that? In the end, he knows that this is a type of excuse that will not go over well since she is hostile to anyone, not even accepting the adventurer's help. However, he is startled to hear her say that everything is perfect, for it means she came from the principality to help them, and thus he assumes that her friends are looking for a safe place to take refuge. This frightens our protagonist at that moment, questioning if he really needed this. The girl said yes and just needed some information, but our protagonist questioned why. That scared her without her fully understanding. However, the boy decides to explain, for he is there only to hunt the ciphers, just like her. Quickly, he realized that this was being shown, since the corruption is evident in a place like that. The woman questions if he really wants to do this, and our protagonist thinks that this is clearly something that does not follow the original course of the story. He quickly tells this disgusting mutant to stop talking, for he already knows clearly that this is being caused by her, and in the end, he thinks he needs to keep her alert at that moment. The girl quickly gets irritated, saying that they are indeed repugnant, even being called normal. Soon her summons appear as she assumes she will ensure to take him down. However, our protagonist gets excited until he realizes that she is going a bit too far. Until suddenly, several sounds of fighting catch his attention. After all, someone else is coming, where our protagonist recognizes the blade skills. Quickly, the protagonist realizes that he cannot make Michelle completely opposed to the chance of receiving help. Thus, he begins to act, saying that the adventurer arrived earlier than he had expected. He heard that she is the type of person who helps everyone, even the dark elves, besides being extremely strong. Therefore, it is better to flee from there without any choice, thus giving the hint to be careful next time. Quickly, the woman becomes irritated. However, someone else approaches, questioning her name. This is Louise, the Queen of Poisons, who introduces herself and says that the one beside her is the adventurer, revealing that they came here to investigate the disease, soon questioning if it's all right to help them at that moment. However, the woman asks them to leave since she has no intention of talking to these normals. Jin-sung thinks that this must be enough to resolve things, and the letter still hasn't appeared. In the end, that is not true corruption, but rather one of the symptoms that occurs, which could mean it is identical to the knights that appeared in the tavern or to the book. The cause of all this is Hildur, who has begun to move and is already doing something even more extreme. Suddenly, we can see a quick movement where the girl's hat has fallen off at once. The adventurer assured to defeat her without causing any severe damage. Her companion tries to say that they are not there to fight but to talk, and our protagonist realizes that they are heading to the next dungeon and has no time to think about things. Soon he will follow them to the Northmire dungeon, where he will find Delizy inside the village of pain called Rashban. It was visible that a huge amount of dark power was emanating from that place. However, the adventurer and her companion were safe due to a barrier that blocked the plague. The woman admitted that they promised to protect the ciphers, and so it's better not to forget. Our protagonist, on the other hand, was in an alley nearby and asked to wait since the person ahead was threatening, and so he asked Azala Lot to listen to him first, where the woman in front of him questioned who he really was. Hildur's plan is to make the adventurers kill the apostles, and by protecting them, they will end up ruining his plan. That's why a secret organization was created called the Hunters of Greed, and this woman in front of him is precisely their leader, who questions why he is following her and mainly his objective. As she had thought, she was keeping an eye on the adventurer at that moment. In the end, potions and antidotes are enough, but the effect will eventually wear off, and that's why a barrier is needed that cannot be provided by Michelle. Now he needs the help of this NPC, and thus introduces himself as Jin-sung, the one who has a suggestion, soon revealing her interests in wanting to stop Hildur and protect the apostle. However, she questioned if it was the right thing to do. This is a real concern she has, where she questioned what was said. Our protagonist said that the Hunters are an organization that wants to prevent the end of the world, but protecting the apostles is not a goal, but rather a means to that end. At this moment, she doesn't need to trust him 100% since he is just someone who wants to stop that wicked woman's plans. After all, the means may be different. However, the result ends up being the same. This is a phrase that this woman has heard in the past from someone who is very important. Thus, she fell silent while staring at our protagonist. Soon lowering her weapon, she said that she knows much more than she had thought. She understands and will not ask more since it is a favor she is doing. Our protagonist quickly said that in the city called Rashpan, Delizia was there, and he needs to go help the adventurer, and the woman understands. She quickly grants a shield to our protagonist in exchange for this help while assuming that it should be enough not to suffer from the plague. Thus, she assumes that if he is really such a person, then he will be able to go to that place and return safely. Quickly, our protagonist's information window opens. He sees that something strange happened. After all, there was no combat, and his level increased, which could mean experience from events. Suddenly, something catches his attention all at once. Thus, he realizes that the adventurer is there and asks Taco to pay attention since they cannot lose this time. Soon we arrive at the designated location where someone sighs at that moment. This being the sixth apostle who called them Hilda's puppets, where all were preparing to fight this creature that did not respect the concept of death. Quickly, the blonde realizes that the corruption has not yet appeared, but soon something will call for it. After all, Hilda will end up opening a rift in space-time itself. This is a subspace where a massive storm occurs, and for an immortal creature, it will be sucked into this space, trying to regenerate infinitely, until it is sealed, where it will only be released when the world comes to its end. However, something will still happen, since Delizia will use his last strength to reopen this rift in space and disappear along with the adventurer. Thus, the boy observes from afar at that moment, where the creature assumed that this was an unfortunate attack with no effect whatsoever. Soon he struck the woman who ended up being thrown against a fragment of the wall. At that moment they shouted for her as they realized her aura was leading her body. However, our protagonist was also someone who noticed as he began to spit ketchup all at once. He realized that the barrier had disappeared while his companion became extremely worried. In the end, Azalea was knocked down and did not expect this to happen. However, she needed to hold on a little longer until the creature was dealt with. She pleaded for them to come before she consumed the entire world, since the plague will never disappear no matter what happens. That attack of thorns flew towards our protagonist who was hit in the chest. His gaze widened as the creature screamed for him. Soon his eyes began to close with agonizing pain being visible, until his own consciousness plunged into a point of no return. He remembered his time when he was just any streamer, and thus he could clearly see a wall in front of him, where all his memories were contained, and he understood that he was dying, until someone called for his attention, thus breaking that space and telling him not to accept his fate. That was a figure known to him who even cut his death at that moment. For in the end, only he should understand one thing, that only he could decide his own destiny in this new world. Thus our protagonist filled himself with hope, soon waking up again while the creature cried beside him. He questioned how he was there since his wounds had been healed, and his companion continued to cry happily for being alive. With that, the smoke was completely cleared and it was now easier to breathe. He was questioned if the creature was really sealed and if everything was over. In the end, they did not understand how that dimensional rift opened, but the creature ended up leaving and they managed to win. However, our protagonist realized that something wrong had just occurred at that moment. After all, the adventurer was still there and should have disappeared along with the final boss. However, he finally understood as he stood up, for that is truly the corruption he must deal with. His companion tried to shout for him, questioning what he was doing. However, our protagonist said he needed to open that again, even not knowing how to do it. However, he thought, and could feel, that he could really do this. In the end, he would expose himself a little more to the plague and would be running out of potions, so he asked his companion to pay attention. For if he did not take care of that, he would receive another penalty, and that is why he needed to stay quiet and concentrate. In the end, he could feel a small fissure opening between two dimensions. Thus his eyes would be enveloped by the darkness he controlled. Soon the woman questioned if they should return as quickly as possible. However, Michelle ended up saying to pay attention to something that was opening. Our protagonist was using all his strength at that moment, while the poison was coming out of that hole in reality. Soon affecting him all at once, however, he knew he could not stop. With that, he shouted with all his strength to remain undefeated. Quickly, the creature's hand emerged and advanced at that moment, thus going towards the adventurer who was paralyzed in that situation. With that, the beast ended up holding her ready to pull him at that moment. And thus it was done all at once, where they questioned how that was possible. In the end, if it weren't for himself, Hilder's plan would have probably worked, and still, they tried to call for the adventurer. Our protagonist finally fell to his knees, admitting that he did this, even not knowing if he would succeed. Soon he said that his companion also did very well. After all, he gave him the potions at the right moment. However, when he looked to the side, he did not notice another path emerging behind him at that moment. The Queen of Poison stated that there was no way the adventurer had truly disappeared. However, the mage ended up noticing the small creature completely desperate after all her master had just vanished. At that moment, we see our protagonist's vision, where he ended up looking back, thus being pulled towards that cut in space-time itself. But in the end, he could not hold on firmly to his support. He tried to call for his little creature while she fell behind. Soon he ended up reaching the place that was full of remnants, and thus a true storm of power was gathering in that space. Our protagonist could feel immense pain at that moment while bleeding. In the end, he could feel as if his own body was being torn apart, piece by piece. until suddenly, a light appeared before him at that moment. The same was surprised to see that in person, since he realized it was the adventurer who was standing still at that moment. While something began to emerge around him suddenly, he noticed it was a barrier that was appearing out of nowhere to protect her, but was actually something unique amidst that dimension resembling a bright moon emerging. Thus, our protagonist remained alert at that moment, soon starting to run as fast as possible, and using his quick movements while thinking he needed to get in before it closed. Quickly he drew his sword while jumping towards the hole, thus preparing a strike at that moment to prevent any attempt to stop him from there, soon breaking that space in one go as if it were made of glass. He sighed, finally feeling safe at that moment. However, that hole still remained in the same place. Soon we could see people in imperial clothing approaching, where the adventurer quickly eliminated them with her skills. She said they continued experimenting with a ghost army, thus questioning who this intruder was that dared to come there. Our protagonist observed everything from above since this was the awakening story of the adventurer. And in the end, if that is the case, then this is a temporary dungeon at that moment. This is a mechanic present in this game that can make someone stronger from a specific level, and they need to go through trauma to achieve their first. In the case of Lamina, she will witness various illusions of her past, and our protagonist will not be noticed by her. Outside, this barrier will be protecting everything from the dimensional storm. And that was the only reason for him to stay alive, and he could feel that if he were out there any longer, he would end up dying. But suddenly something caught his attention to a strange and nearby noise, and as he turned, he noticed an extremely familiar shadow, being Delazy, who was ready to try to enter. She was exploring, looking for the slightest gap. However, our protagonist realized that being immortal in that situation was not a good thing. Thus he thought he should just ignore it and keep following the adventurer who was more important. In the end, she would manage to use her awakened power to open a rift in space, and if she couldn't get out with him, she would most likely be trapped forever. All he needed to do was follow her completely quietly until he noticed something dripping on the ground. That scared him, especially not realizing that the creature had found what it needed. The gap that was quickly left served to pass with its completely wet body. Quickly the boy realized that was the small crack that had opened when he entered there, and now it was a cause of corruption in that world. Thus the creature finally fell to the ground right in front of him, then starting to rematerialize while staring at him. The blonde promptly realized he was clearly screwed in that situation. The creature, on the other hand, was staring at him, briefly recognizing him, and then aggressively assumed it would find a way to get back home, being this the demonic realm which our protagonist could not allow. Soon the creature noticed another presence nearby. Its gaze lingered on his figure, until it realized it was Hilder's puppet and thus assumed it would find a way to kill her. But our protagonist quickly used a wave of shadows, assuming he could not allow that. The creature questioned who the hell he was while attacking him repeatedly, and in that watery form, he could quickly perceive a spike coming towards his eye, soon closing it clearly in a trap that could kill him in one go. But he was quick enough to manage a teleport at the last minute. In the end, this is the worst kind of situation because he has to fight against such a creature and questions why the poison isn't working. However, he decides to just accept it, assuming this is his chance, thus using the Great Wave. The creature then assumed it could clearly remember everything, especially that woman, then screaming that it was all her fault while advancing towards the protagonist. A heated battle was occurring in the background while the adventurer continued her mission. Jinsun kept teleporting and dodging the creature's strikes incessantly. He assumed these attacks were unpredictable, and besides that, it was still capable of regenerating. Thus he again used his ability to dodge another blow. The creature questioned if he would really keep running this way, until suddenly it noticed a purple light coming from below where our boy used the Shadow Ball with a Pokemon move, thus shouting that he would now use his 200%. In a dark crushing blow that hit the creature directly, he continued with heavy breathing at that moment. While assuming he would be unable to kill him, he only needed to keep diminishing his regeneration. Thus, he assumed that with this time, it would already be enough, without realizing something coming from behind him. Several spikes then advanced as he startled, unable to dodge. Soon the ketchup ended up gushing, and now he found himself on the ground, injured. The creature watched him and assumed he truly had iron instincts, and so it began to attack him and pierce him with its spikes once again, saying it would be easier if he just ended up dying this time. But suddenly the ceiling ended up breaking at that moment, which meant the dungeon was collapsing, and our protagonist finally realized that the worst kind of situation had just happened. He quickly cursed, realizing that the adventurer had finally completed her awakening. The creature quickly noticed that this was the way out of this turmoil. Our protagonist, on the other hand, told it to be quiet because he wouldn't let it leave. However, the demonic dog assumed that it should at least experience what it was like to have its body torn apart by the storm while it would enjoy destroying his world. The latter, on the other hand, questioned if that was some kind of joke or something like that, thus assuming that because of him something unforgivable had occurred. For a great genocide was committed due to the mere presence of this infernal dog, where the creature sighed and assumed it was really interesting. For all of them tried to kill just for existing. However, it questioned who our protagonist was to determine who was good and who was evil in the end, but he kept shouting that he was just a puppet in Hilda's hands, thus assuming he would never be able to return to the demon realm. The creature then began to run, assuming it knew quite a bit for a piece of trash, and so it advanced toward the portal, leaving our protagonist behind, while he could clearly feel that barrier opening at that moment. Soon we could clearly see that the storm began to break the outer part of the barrier. As the creature advanced as fast as possible toward the exit, our protagonist begged, but suddenly that fissure ended up closing all at once. The creature questioned what that was while a light came from above. Our protagonist was responsible after all. It was easier than opening and assumed he couldn't escape. Quickly, the demonic dog realized that the boy was responsible and thus questioned how he managed to do that. Then it lunged at him, demanding that he reopen it as quickly as possible. The boy, on the other hand, swung his sword, defending himself from the incoming blows. However, the dog kept advancing, calling him an insect, unaware that suddenly a giant tentacle emerged and struck its head all at once. Our protagonist ended up hitting his back against one of the walls at that moment, while the creature also felt the pain due to having lost a large part of its mass. Jim Sung assumed he had no more stamina or time to continue fighting this way. Thus, he asked the creature to be grateful because he had just saved its life, further confusing it. With that, it showed to be so heavy, asking him not to get in its way, and so our protagonist stared at it at that moment, realizing that he truly understood that if it wanted, the dog could continue spreading its plagues all over Arad. However, it didn't step a foot outside of Reshpan in the end. Thus, he questioned if it understood the reason for that, to which the creature, completely irritated, ordered him to shut his mouth immediately. But the blonde assumed that his companion was truly pathetic since it kept thinking about life and death in such a regressed way, and in the end, he assumed that all this conscious beast desired was just to return to its home where it had the proper peace and fun. In the end, that irritated the demonic dog even more, telling him to be quiet at that moment, while our protagonist called out its name in thought, thus assuming that he was perhaps the only human capable of understanding this rejected creature. Soon he assumed he understood what it was like to feel that way, for if it were up to either of them at that moment, both could go home one way or another. The creature grew even angrier, questioning if he really could understand, thus telling him to stop that since he would never be able to know how she felt. In the end, Jim Sung was just an insect who understood nothing, and explained that he himself fell into a world where everything was trying to kill him, and every day these creatures tried to tear him in half, which was simply an immense nuisance. With that, our protagonist then kicked the giant dog's chin, which quickly stumbled back while the boy assumed he knew all that, because he was heading directly for a normal day until waking up in this place and being forced to fight and deal with major problems. All he wanted was to go back home where he could look at the sky calmly and recognize the stars of the world he loved so much, and that brought him happiness. The creature then stared at that moment, thinking a bit about this, realizing that there is indeed something in common with a mere human in front of him. Our protagonist then asked to be heard since the tear in space-time was not completely closed yet. Even though it was small, he could still feel it and open it. Thus, the creature asked for it to be done. However, he assumed there was no point in leaving at that moment since Hildur would find out immediately. The creature tried to speak, but the blonde replied that he could not fight against her and win in his current form. In the end, this woman is one of the great mages of this world who can manipulate apostles in an incredible way, and then questions how it would be a variable that even this woman could not foresee. Now, there may be actors who still do not wish to leave the stage at this moment. Thus, it was said that the woman thought the dog was dead, so she should hide there and prepare for the climax that is about to come, since it would ensure giving the same a chance to achieve his long-desired revenge against the creature. This is not an order or an attempt to manipulate him, but rather an equal exchange for both sides. Thus, he asked Delazier to fight by his side against that nefarious creature. Quickly, he questioned if he was leaving and asked him to wait there. In the end, he wanted to be honest since he had already had a great opportunity to leave and escape on his own. However, he did not, and thus the dimension began to reverberate. Now they did not have much time, and thus our protagonist called for the creature, who at that moment was thoughtful and growling for a while, thus assuming that he could not even laugh at a situation like that. Our protagonist then understood the wrong things, and questioned if he really wanted to be trapped there forever because of his ego. He then shouted once more, calling her as the barrier was broken. Suddenly, Jimstone could quickly feel some damage passing through his body, until the shadow took over his surroundings at that moment all at once. He should not have the wrong idea, since he does not intend to entertain him. However, he is interested in this plan. If he manages to split the woman in half, then he can wait some eras and ask for proof from the protagonist. He became confused. Then it was said that he should show a form that proved he could keep his promise. Thus, our boy quickly took a piece of the creature that continued speaking. He then assumed that if she was so nervous about this, then she could see for herself. The dog quickly could make some pieces of his body turn into clones. So if he breaks his promise, he guarantees to let her kill him. That made the dog laugh because he finally understood it was a mutually beneficial agreement. Soon the storm began to approach and attack with a target on our protagonist. However, he was protected. Thus, the creature decided to question what his plan would be in the end, where it was said that he needed to find a way to get out of there through that small fissure that exists in space. Thus, we can clearly see that it remains open. However, it will close very soon. Our protagonist quickly explained the plan, leaving the creature questioning if it really made sense. But in the end, all that needs to be said is just a small propulsion from there. Quickly, the demonic dog called for the human and then decided to question what his true name was. The boy then smiled, seeing that he finally made a friend from there. Thus, he advanced towards the exit as fast as he could, soon teleporting numerous times to continue gaining more momentum, thus getting closer to that crack as quickly as possible, while holding his sword ready to break through. Soon after, he did so, crossing into the real world once again, and leaving a huge crater in his wake, where he now found himself finally far from that nefarious world. With heavy breathing, he assumed he finally managed to get out of there the right way. However, his little companion suddenly rushed towards him, giving him a tight hug. Our protagonist quickly asked him not to repeat that since he would die from his injuries. Already inside the dimensional fissure, the creature laughed, saying it would wait for Jinsung no matter how long it took. We can observe another place where it is said they need to prioritize support for the hospital since the refugees from North Meyer must have access to their needs. In the end, they need to find a way to have a good rest, and thus the man finally understood. Sharon has been very busy and hasn't had any kind of rest since Ophelia. So she thinks this is quite a problem and then questions where our protagonist has been, until a voice calls her attention from behind. This being our star, who asks if she has any potions left with her. However, she ends up falling to the ground due to the gravity of her injuries at that moment. Soon we can see the Mage Guild from afar, where our protagonist is lying, moving slightly in bed, until he finally opens his eyes, waking up, where he questions where he is until he realizes it's the guild leader's room. The woman asks if he has finally woken up after that. Our protagonist calls for Sharan, who asks how he is since she took care of all his injuries. Where the boy assumed he was doing very well after all. However, that wasn't surprising, since he had been completely unconscious for over a week, which scares him. He thanks her for taking care of his equipment, however. He has no intention of returning the favor. Thus, a great purple light began to spread throughout the place, for there must be a good answer along with unparalleled confidence. To respond to what he is planning to do, bringing a fragment of Delizy to the city, she questions if he understands how dangerous this is, as he should report this to the principality as soon as possible. Thus, the blonde ends up understanding that he cannot use this as an excuse to deceive her. He soon admits that he ended up fighting against the creature at some point. It was when he encountered her that he realized he was being forced to corrupt the land using his uncontrollable power while someone attacked Arad. And in that kind of situation, he had no choice but to defend her on his own, where the woman got irritated hearing this because many people died. In the end, when someone commits a crime, the person is responsible. And that's why he made a deal ensuring the creature's revenge while allowing it to stay alive. And now this fragment serves as an observer to ensure that he will fulfill his part of the deal. The woman then questions how he had the courage to make a deal with an apostle. But he pleaded with a please at that moment since he needed help to use those powers. The woman questioned if he wanted to bring her to this world, where it was said no, as he only needed to make a small armor with that power. In the end, he asked for a little trust at that moment, for he also doesn't want the plague to end up spreading through the city he likes. She then questions if he understands how much they have already suffered. But in the end, she intends to act as if she hadn't heard anything from then on. Thus, she makes a seal with her hand at that exact moment, soon releasing while assuming that she will act as if it has nothing to do with her. Our protagonist promptly thanks her while it is said that she doesn't believe he is right. However, she is paying back the favor he did by saving her homeland. That's why she questions if he will be able to purify the plague and extract the powers of an apostle since it will take some time. She quickly ends up questioning about his equipment, where the woman points to the side, thus seeing our protagonist's tentacle sword completely broken. His little octopus becomes completely desperate since it was a very important part of all that. So he wonders where he should go since he has no remaining materials to make equipment. Now he really needs something to replace the giant tentacle. But now that he has leveled up, he might be able to get something even better. After all, he has over 100 million gold with him at this moment. Until suddenly a smell reaches him. He wonders what it could be, or he can hear someone talking about certain things about clothing. He is questioned if that isn't a bit too much to be flaunting in the middle of the city, since this person is wearing a completely disgusting kind of avatar. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, folks.